A wealthy couple who had everything except a child of their own decided to adopt after years of believing they couldn't conceive. When they welcomed a young black child into their home, a routine medical checkup revealed something extraordinary. The child shared a rare genetic marker with the millionaire father. This discovery led to shocking news. The man wasn't sterile after all, and fate had brought his biological child back to him through adoption. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sprawling mansion, usually a testament to Richard and Eleanor's success, felt suffocatingly empty. Sunlight glinted off the polished marble floors, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the stillness. Eleanor traced the delicate carvings on a mahogany table, a familiar ache settling in her chest. Years of longing, of whispered prayers unanswered, clung to the air like a persistent perfume. Another failed cycle, she'd murmured to Richard that morning, her voice barely above a breath. Richard, ever the pragmatist, had simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the financial reports spread across his desk. His ambition, a shield against the vulnerability of his heart, had always been his refuge. Perhaps adoption is the answer, Eleanor had suggested, her voice wavering slightly. The silence that followed stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. It was a silence filled with unspoken fears and a shared, deep sorrow. Richard's silence, however, finally cracked. "Yes, Eleanor," he replied, his voice low, his eyes meeting hers. A glimmer of hope, fragile as spun glass, sparked between them. The decision, born from years of quiet despair, was a tentative step towards a future they'd almost given up on. The opulent home, once a symbol of their success, now held the promise of something far more precious. The adoption agency felt sterile, despite the cheerful pastel walls and the forced smiles of the social workers. Eleanor clutched Richard's hand, her knuckles bone white. The scent of antiseptic and freshly brewed coffee battled for dominance in the air, a strange counterpoint to the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. Richard, usually so composed, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flitting around the room. The paperwork seemed endless, a mountain of legal jargon threatening to bury the fragile hope blooming within them. He's 8, Eleanor whispered, her voice catching. A photograph, tucked into a file, showed a small boy with dark, intelligent eyes and a hesitant smile. Elijah. The name felt both foreign and intimately familiar, already echoing in her heart. Richard cleared his throat, his voice a low rumble. 8 years. A lot of time already lived. He looked down at their clasped hands, his thumb tracing the delicate lines of her palm. He didn't speak of the years they'd spent desperately longing for a child, the failed treatments, the mounting disappointment. The unspoken words hung heavy between them, a shared silence that spoke volumes of their journey. Weeks later, Elijah stood on their doorstep, a small, quiet figure clutching a worn teddy bear. The grand entrance hall, usually echoing with the emptiness of their vast home, now held a different kind of silence, a quiet anticipation, tinged with nervous excitement. Eleanor's breath hitched as Elijah's eyes, wide and wary, took in the opulence surrounding him. The plush carpets, the ornate chandeliers, the sheer scale of it all. It was a stark contrast to the life he'd known. Richard, his usual stiffness softened by an unexpected tenderness, knelt to Elijah's level. "Welcome home, son," he murmured, his voice unexpectedly gentle. The words felt awkward, clumsy, yet profoundly sincere. Elijah, after a long moment, offered a small, shy smile. The teddy bear was clutched tighter to his chest, a tangible representation of his apprehension. The mansion, once a symbol of their loneliness, now held the fragile promise of a family. The air, still filled with the scent of expensive polish and leather, now held a new fragrance, the subtle sweetness of hope. The silence, once heavy with despair, now hummed with the quiet beginnings of something new. The first few months were a blur of tentative smiles, quiet observations, and the gentle hum of a new routine settling into the grand, echoing spaces of their home. Eleanor, usually reserved, blossomed, her laughter echoing through the once silent halls. Richard, however, remained a study in controlled affection. His love for Elijah was evident in the small, almost furtive gestures, a perfectly placed toy, a carefully chosen book, a quiet story whispered at bedtime. But the emotional distance remained, a subtle barrier between him and the boy who was slowly, surely, becoming his son. One sunny afternoon, while Elijah meticulously constructed a complex Lego castle, Richard watched from across the vast playroom. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The scene was idyllic, almost painfully so, yet a knot of unease tightened in Richard's chest. "That's quite a fortress, Elijah," he said, his voice hesitant. Elijah looked up, his dark eyes mirroring the intelligence Richard had noticed from the start. "It's impenetrable," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Like a real castle." "Is it?" Richard knelt beside him, his touch light as he examined a particularly intricate tower. "Even from a dragon?" Elijah smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made Richard's heart catch. "Especially from a dragon," he replied, his eyes sparkling with mischief. That evening, during Elijah's bedtime story, a small, almost imperceptible cough from Elijah caught Richard's attention. The next morning, a routine checkup was scheduled. The anticipation that morning was palpable, a stark contrast to the seemingly ordinary nature of the visit. Eleanor, brimming with maternal concern, prepared Elijah with a gentle reassurance and a warm hug, while Richard felt an inexplicable tightening in his throat, a feeling far stronger than mere paternal anxiety. The car ride was quiet, the silence filled with unspoken anxieties and a growing sense of foreboding that neither Eleanor nor Richard could quite articulate. The looming appointment hung over them like a storm cloud, promising something significant, something life-altering, yet leaving them unaware of the precise nature of the coming upheaval. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old magazines. Eleanor, clutching a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, hummed a quiet tune, a fragile melody against the hushed anxiety of the space. Richard, however, sat rigid, his gaze fixed on the sterile white walls. The polished chrome of the chairs reflected his own strained face, the sharp angles of his jawline emphasized by the harsh fluorescent lights. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, a physical manifestation of his suppressed fear. Elijah, perched between them, fiddled with a small, worn toy car. His usual quiet demeanor was replaced by a nervous energy, his small hands twisting the car's wheels incessantly. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the occasional cough from Elijah and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Each tick felt like a hammer blow against Richard's already frayed nerves. "He's fine, Richard," Eleanor murmured, her voice soft yet firm, sensing his mounting tension. Her hand rested briefly on his, a silent reassurance. He barely registered her touch, lost in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Doubt, a ghost from his past, haunted him. The possibility of a biological connection to this child, this vibrant, intelligent boy, felt both thrilling and terrifying. A nurse called Elijah's name, her voice a calm counterpoint to the turmoil raging within Richard. Eleanor squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared apprehension. He looked at Elijah, his son, his heart aching with a love both fierce and uncertain. The boy offered a small, hesitant smile, his dark eyes reflecting a mixture of apprehension and trust. As they followed the nurse down the long corridor, the rhythmic thump of Richard's heart echoed in his ears, a frantic drumbeat against the sterile silence of the hospital. The weight of expectation pressed down on them, a heavy blanket stifling their breath. This simple checkup felt monumental, a pivotal moment poised to rewrite their lives. The door to the examination room loomed, a threshold to an unknown future. The air crackled with unspoken questions, unanswered prayers, and the palpable weight of a secret yet to be revealed. The examination room was small, sterile, smelling faintly of rubbing alcohol and something vaguely floral, an attempt at softening the clinical harshness. Elijah, surprisingly calm, sat on the examination table, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. Dr. Ramirez, a kind-faced woman with warm brown eyes, examined him with gentle efficiency. Eleanor watched, her anxiety a tight knot in her stomach, a stark contrast to the quiet confidence radiating from Richard. He sat rigidly, his posture betraying the storm within him. He hadn't spoken much since leaving the waiting room, his silence heavier than any words. Everything seems perfectly normal, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, Dr. Ramirez announced, her voice soft but firm. Elijah is a healthy, vibrant young boy. A wave of relief washed over Eleanor, a visible exhale of tension. She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. Richard, however, remained impassive, his gaze fixed on Elijah's small, still form. Dr. Ramirez paused, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. There is one anomaly, a minor genetic marker, quite rare actually. She continued, her voice carefully measured. It's something I need to discuss further with you both privately. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The floral scent now felt cloying, oppressive. Eleanor's smile faltered. What do you mean, anomaly? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes, usually bright and sparkling, held a sudden, apprehensive gleam. Richard remained silent, his gaze unwavering on his son. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a chilling premonition that this minor anomaly would shatter their carefully constructed world. The doctor's words hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. The warmth of the room now felt suffocating, the silence echoing the pounding of Richard's heart. The casual, friendly atmosphere of the exam room had vanished, replaced by an expectant tension. The seemingly routine checkup had suddenly morphed into something profoundly more significant. The small, sterile office felt suddenly oppressive. The scent of antiseptic, previously unnoticed, now clawed at Eleanor's throat. Richard's silence was a physical presence, a wall between them and the doctor's hesitant words. He watched Elijah, his son, his gaze a mixture of fierce protectiveness and terrifying uncertainty. It's a marker, Doctor. Ramirez began again, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. A very rare one. It indicates a specific gene sequence, one that, frankly, is statistically improbable to appear in someone with Elijah's background. She paused, choosing her words with painstaking care. It's a match. The word hung in the air, heavy and pregnant with meaning. Eleanor gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound that sliced through the tense quiet. A match? A match to what? Richard finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with suppressed emotion. To whom? Dr. Ramirez, her gaze flickering between the couple, hesitated again before answering. To Mr. Sterling's genetic profile. The air thickened, choked with the unspoken. Eleanor stared at Richard, her face a mask of disbelief. Her eyes, once filled with relief, now burned with a bewildering array of emotions. Shock, confusion, a flicker of hesitant joy. Richard remained still, his face unreadable, a storm raging beneath the surface of his carefully controlled exterior. Only the subtle tremor in his hand, gripping the armrest of his chair, betrayed the turmoil within. The quiet hum of the air conditioner suddenly seemed deafening, a relentless soundtrack to their stunned silence. The revelation hung between them, an unspoken question mark that threatened to unravel their lives. The floral scent, once a subtle attempt at comfort, now felt sickly sweet, the artificiality a grotesque contrast to the raw, potent emotions filling the small room. The doctor's quiet observation, a seemingly simple medical anomaly, had shattered their carefully constructed world, leaving them adrift in a sea of disbelief and overwhelming possibilities. The drive home was a blur, the familiar streets of their affluent neighborhood seeming alien and distorted. Eleanor, usually so composed, fidgeted, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the plush leather of the car seat. The silence between her and Richard was thick, a suffocating blanket woven from disbelief and unspoken questions. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the opulent interiors of their home in a dramatic, unsettling light. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He glanced at Eleanor, her face etched with a mixture of wonder and fear, and a wave of guilt washed over him. Years of self-imposed exile from fatherhood, years of believing himself barren, and now this, a child, his child, brought to him through a twist of fate. It can't be true, he finally muttered, his voice rough, barely a whisper above the hum of the engine. Eleanor didn't answer immediately, her eyes fixed on the manicured lawns blurring past. The opulent surroundings, once a source of pride and comfort, felt suddenly hollow, mocking their internal turmoil. But the test, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. It's a 1 in a million chance, she said. Richard pulled into their driveway, the imposing gates slowly opening to reveal their vast, imposing home. It felt less like a haven and more like a gilded cage. He switched off the ignition, the silence returning with a deafening roar. He turned to Eleanor, his gaze searching hers. What if it is true? He asked, the question hanging heavy in the air, thick with a potent cocktail of fear and hope. The fear was palpable, a cold knot in his stomach. The hope, a fragile seedling pushing its way through the hardened earth of his denial. Eleanor reached across, her hand covering his. Her touch was surprisingly firm, a silent reassurance in the face of the unfolding chaos. We'll find out, she said, her voice softer now, a gentle counterpoint to his turmoil. We'll face this together, Richard, whatever it is. Her unwavering gaze, her unwavering faith, was a lifeline in the storm brewing inside him. The weight of his past, the fear of confronting it, the sheer magnitude of the revelation, it threatened to crush him. Yet, in her eyes, he saw not judgment, but acceptance, a silent promise of shared journey, no matter how arduous the path ahead. The seed of doubt that had been planted in the sterile office now blossomed into a fragile hope, a hopeful defiance against the fear. The long road ahead was daunting, but at least they wouldn't walk it alone. The following days were a blur of paperwork, doctor's appointments, and hushed conversations. Elijah, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, continued to be his cheerful, inquisitive self, his laughter echoing through the cavernous rooms of their home, a stark contrast to the weight pressing down on Eleanor and Richard. The house, usually a symbol of their success, felt suffocating, its opulence a cruel mockery of their emotional turmoil. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, Richard found himself watching Elijah from the doorway of his study. The boy sat at the antique writing desk, meticulously drawing, his brow furrowed in concentration. The gentle scratching of pencil on paper was the only sound in the otherwise silent room. A wave of overwhelming emotion washed over Richard, a mixture of guilt, wonder, and a nascent love that surprised even him. He felt a sharp pang of regret for the years he'd spent distanced, believing himself incapable of fatherhood. He's so much like you, Eleanor murmured, appearing beside him. Her voice was soft, laced with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Richard finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. He couldn't speak, the emotion clogging his throat. He only nodded, the silent acknowledgement a testament to the shared revelation hanging between them like a fragile, precious crystal. The silence that followed was charged, heavy with the unspoken questions, the looming uncertainty. He broke the silence, his voice low. I never thought. I know, Eleanor said, her hand finding his. Her touch was a grounding force in the emotional chaos. But we have him, Richard. We have Elijah. She squeezed his hand gently, offering him solace and strength, a silent promise of shared burdens and shared joys. The fear that had gripped them both seemed to lessen, replaced by a tentative hope, a fragile strength born of their shared experience. The gilded cage began to feel less like a prison, and more like a sanctuary, where a new family was slowly, tentatively, being built. The following weeks unfolded in a haze of normalcy punctuated by moments of stark, unsettling revelation. Elijah, oblivious, continued his routine, his quiet mornings spent poring over books in the sun-drenched library, the afternoon dedicated to his meticulous drawings, the evenings filled with games of chess with Richard, a game the boy had surprisingly mastered. Richard, however, found himself observing Elijah with a new, unsettling intensity. Every subtle quirk of expression, every fleeting gesture, seemed to echo a phantom memory, a ghost of a self he'd long buried. One evening, after a particularly intense chess match, a rare loss for Richard, Elijah retreated to his room. Richard followed, the heavy oak door creaking behind him. The room, a carefully curated space filled with toys, books, and artwork, felt both familiar and alien. He stood by the window, watching the boy meticulously arrange his collection of miniature dinosaurs, their plastic scales gleaming under the soft lamplight. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic click of plastic against plastic. "Elijah," Richard finally said, his voice rough, barely a whisper. The boy looked up, his large, dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. There was a quiet sadness in their depths, a subtle melancholy that Richard had only recently begun to notice, a sadness that resonated with a deep, unspoken ache within himself. "Yes, Dad." Elijah's voice was soft, tinged with a tentative respect Richard hadn't fully earned yet. "You know, you're remarkably good at chess," Richard said, his words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He searched for the right words, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and burgeoning emotion. Elijah smiled, a shy, hesitant smile that touched Richard's heart. "Grandpa taught me," he said. "It helps you think." The mention of a grandfather Richard didn't know sent a jolt through him. The weight of his past, the secrets he had carefully locked away, felt heavier than ever. He felt the familiar, icy grip of fear, but beneath it, a new, hesitant warmth was growing. He wanted to tell Elijah everything, to bridge the chasm of silence and years, but the sheer magnitude of the revelation paralyzed him. He settled for a simple, "That's good." He knelt beside his son, the scent of the boy's clean pajamas and slightly sweet skin filling his senses. For the first time, Richard felt a true connection, a genuine bond that transcended the carefully constructed facade he'd presented to the world. He placed a hand gently on Elijah's shoulder, the warmth of his touch a silent apology for the years of emotional distance. The weight of his past actions felt crushing, but the tentative hope budding within him felt brighter than ever. The journey ahead was fraught with challenges, but the newfound love, fragile as it was a beacon guiding him forward. The gilded cage no longer felt like a prison. It was at last beginning to feel like home. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and damp earth, seeped through the open windows of Elijah's room. Sunlight slanted across the miniature dinosaur graveyard he'd meticulously constructed on his rug. Richard watched, his heart a tight knot in his chest. The silence, thick with unspoken anxieties, hung heavy between them. He cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the quiet room. "Elijah," he began, his voice raspy. "That chess game, it was impressive." Elijah looked up, his dark eyes, so much like his own, reflecting the lamplight. A hesitant smile touched his lips. "Grandpa taught me," he said softly, the words a tiny pebble dropped into the still pool of Richard's guilt. "He said it sharpens your mind." The mention of a grandpa Richard knew nothing about sent a fresh wave of unease through him. The carefully constructed walls of his denial began to crumble. He wanted to ask, to probe, but the fear, a cold serpent, coiled around his heart. He knelt beside his son, the faint scent of lavender from Elijah's pajamas mixing with the earthy smell of the autumn air. The boy's skin, soft and warm under his hand, felt impossibly fragile. A wave of protectiveness washed over Richard, drowning out the fear. "He sounds special," Richard murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He searched for words, but they eluded him, caught in the tangled threads of his past. Elijah nodded, his gaze distant, lost in a memory Richard couldn't share. "He taught me a lot, about everything." His voice trailed off, a hint of sadness coloring his words. Richard swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. The truth, a heavy stone, pressed down on his chest. He had to tell Elijah. He had to break through the carefully constructed wall of silence that separated them. But the sheer magnitude of the revelation, the potential repercussions, left him paralyzed by fear. He looked at his son, his own reflection staring back at him from those dark, expressive eyes. The gilded cage, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison, its bars forged from his own lies and omissions. He had to find the key, to unlock the truth and finally set himself and Elijah free. The journey ahead, he knew, would be arduous, but the tentative warmth blooming in his heart was a fragile beacon, guiding him toward a future he could barely imagine. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson. Inside, the grand living room of the Richardson estate felt oddly cold, despite the crackling fire in the hearth. Elijah, curled up on a plush velvet armchair, traced patterns on a worn copy of Alice in Wonderland. Eleanor, her usual vibrant energy subdued, sat nearby, her needle flashing rhythmically as she mended a tear in Elijah's favorite shirt. The silence was punctuated only by the gentle ticking of an antique grandfather clock. Richard paced, his expensive loafers making barely a sound on the Persian rug. His usually impeccably groomed hair was disheveled, his tailored suit rumpled. The weight of the doctor's words pressed down on him, the rare genetic marker, the overwhelming probability, his son, his own flesh and blood. "He's tired," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the tense silence. She glanced at Richard, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and unspoken questions. Richard stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. He looked at Elijah, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and overwhelming love. The boy's quiet absorption in his book felt like a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. He saw his own features mirrored in Elijah's dark eyes, and the resemblance sent a fresh wave of shock through him. The boy's quiet sadness echoed a similar ache in his own past. He wanted to rush to Elijah, to confess everything, but the fear held him captive. The fear of rejection, of shattering the fragile peace they'd established. The fear of facing the truth about his own past, the sterility he had always believed to be an immutable fact. Eleanor rose, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Richard," she said, her voice laced with empathy. "We need to talk. We need to decide how to approach this." He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of his secret, the unspoken truth, felt like a physical burden. He looked back at Elijah, his son, a child he'd only recently welcomed into his life, now inextricably linked to him by something far deeper than adoption papers. The opulent setting, once a symbol of success, now felt like a gilded cage, confining him to a past he desperately needed to confront. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but the love in his heart for this boy, this son, was undeniable. He had to find a way. He had to tell Elijah. The time for silence was over. The following weeks blurred into a gentle routine, punctuated by Elijah's infectious laughter and the quiet hum of domesticity. Eleanor, ever the observant one, noticed the subtle shifts in Richard. He lingered longer at the dinner table, his gaze often lingering on Elijah, a faint smile playing on his lips. He even started reading Elijah bedtime stories, his deep baritone voice a soothing counterpoint to the boy's quiet sighs. Yet, a shadow still clung to Richard, a quiet unease that clung to him like a second skin. He'd started taking long walks in the sprawling gardens surrounding their estate, the manicured lawns a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. One crisp autumn evening, after a particularly engaging game of chess with Elijah, Richard found himself drawn to the grand piano in the drawing room. The polished ebony gleamed under the soft lamplight. He hadn't touched it in years, the music a forgotten language. He sat down, his fingers hovering hesitantly over the ivory keys. Elijah, curled up on a nearby sofa, watched him with quiet intensity. "You play, Papa?" Elijah asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard hesitated. The memory of his father's booming laughter, the joy of shared music, felt like a distant dream. "Years ago," he said, his voice raspy, "I used to." He played a hesitant melody, a simple tune that seemed to capture the bittersweet longing in his heart. The notes were tentative at first, then grew stronger, richer, infused with a raw emotion that surprised even him. Elijah listened, his gaze fixed on his adoptive father, a sense of understanding dawning in his eyes. When the last note faded, a comfortable silence settled between them. Richard looked at Elijah, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The boy's quiet intelligence, his resilience, his subtle sadness, it all resonated with a deep chord within him. The bond between them, forged in the crucible of adoption, felt stronger, deeper now, tinged with an unspoken truth that hung heavy in the air. The fear of shattering this newfound peace was palpable. Yet, the need to unravel the mystery of the genetic marker, the undeniable evidence of a father-son connection, was equally strong. "There's something I need to tell you," Richard began, his voice barely audible, the words catching in his throat. He paused, gathering his courage, the silence stretching into an eternity. Elijah nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight, his expression calm yet expectant. The weight of the revelation pressed down upon Richard. He was about to embark on the most significant journey of his life, a journey into the past to claim his present, a journey that could redefine his entire future. The sterile white walls of Dr. Albright's office seemed to amplify the silence. The scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the comforting aroma of home that usually clung to Elijah. Dr. Albright, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, shuffled papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. The air crackled with unspoken anxieties. Eleanor, radiant with nervous energy, clasped her hands in her lap, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. Richard, however, sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window. "The results, they're unusual, Doctor." Albright began hesitantly, her voice barely a whisper. She pushed a folder across the polished mahogany desk. "Elijah possesses a rare genetic marker. It's extremely uncommon." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What does it mean?" she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Doctor." Albright hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It means that, well, it suggests a possible, albeit highly improbable, familial connection to Mr. Lancaster." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat, a gasp of pure joy. She turned to Richard, her eyes wide with wonder. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "It means—" Richard didn't respond. He remained frozen, his face ashen, his eyes reflecting a storm of conflicting emotions, disbelief, fear, a flicker of something that resembled hope. The weight of the revelation crashed down upon him. The years of tests, the crushing diagnosis of sterility, the carefully constructed facade of acceptance. It all crumbled in an instant. The opulent emptiness of his life, the relentless pursuit of success, all seemed futile in the face of this unexpected truth. His carefully constructed world was irrevocably altered. The joy on Eleanor's face, the innocence in Elijah's eyes, all of it threatened to be shattered by this discovery. His silence, however, was not merely stunned shock, but a quiet terror at what this revelation could mean. He was facing a reality he had buried deep within himself. His past, long suppressed, was resurfacing with a force that threatened to overwhelm him. The drive home was a blur. Eleanor hummed a cheerful tune, her happiness a tangible thing, vibrating in the plush leather seats of their Mercedes. The scent of pine from the air freshener, usually unnoticed, now felt imbued with the magic of possibility. Richard, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the blurring landscape. The sterile scent of the doctor's office clung to him, a stark contrast to Eleanor's joyful perfume. He felt the weight of the world pressing down, a suffocating blanket of disbelief. Richard. Eleanor's voice, usually bright and bubbly, held a tentative note. She reached out, her hand resting briefly on his. He flinched, pulling away. I need some time, he mumbled, his voice rough. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. The opulent houses lining the street, usually a source of quiet pride, now felt like mocking reminders of his carefully constructed life. A life built on a foundation of lies. Eleanor's smile faltered. But, Elijah, she whispered, her voice catching. This could be amazing. Richard's eyes flicked to her, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. Amazing? He echoed, the words sounding bitter on his tongue. Or terrifying. What if this changes everything? He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The car seemed to hum with the tension between them. He glanced at Eleanor again, her face a mask of confusion mixed with hurt. The carefree joy that had filled the car moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a heavy cloud of apprehension. He realized that he had failed to see her own years of longing, her quiet desperation reflected in the careful nurturing of a barren home, waiting for a chance to overflow with love. And now that chance had come, tinged with a complexity beyond his comprehension. He pulled into the driveway of their mansion, the vast, empty space mocking their newfound uncertainty. The silence in the car was heavier than any words. The revelation hung between them, a silent, menacing guest. The heavy oak door of their mansion seemed to mock their silence. Inside, the usually immaculate home felt alien, cold. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, usually a balm, now hung heavy and cloying in the stillness. Richard sank into a plush armchair, the soft leather doing little to cushion the turmoil inside him. Eleanor stood by the fireplace, the flickering flames mirroring the uncertain flicker of hope in her eyes. It's a lot to take in, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the cavernous silence. She ran a hand through her hair, the gesture betraying the tremor in her hands. Richard didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ornate Persian rug beneath his feet. The intricate patterns seemed to blur, mirroring the confusion in his mind. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, a physical burden that threatened to crush him. He thought of Elijah, his laughter, his bright eyes, the way he'd snuggled into Eleanor's arms. The image was jarring, juxtaposed against the sterile environment of the doctor's office, the cold precision of the genetic test results. What if he doesn't want to know? Richard finally said, his voice rough. The words felt like shards of glass in his throat. Eleanor turned, her expression etched with concern. He's 8 years old, Richard. We'll tell him in a way he can understand. We'll be there for him. She moved closer, her hand reaching out hesitantly to touch his arm. This time he didn't flinch. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the worry etched into her beautiful face, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes that he had never truly noticed before. He had been so wrapped up in his own shock, his own internal struggle, that he'd missed her quiet strength, her unwavering love. I never wanted to hurt you, Eleanor, he mumbled, his voice choked with emotion. I built this life, this perfect image, and now, he trailed off, unable to articulate the fear that consumed him. The fear of shattering their meticulously crafted world. The fear of losing her. Eleanor's hand tightened on his arm, a silent gesture of reassurance. We'll face this together, Richard. Whatever happens, we are a family. Her voice, though soft, held an unwavering strength. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, the only sound in the vast room, except for their ragged breaths. The silence hung heavy between them, yet it felt different now. It was no longer filled with apprehension but with a shared burden, a shared responsibility, a shared love that had the potential to mend their broken past and forge a new future. The following days were a blur of hushed phone calls, anxious glances, and the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to Richard's clothes. He avoided Elijah, the guilt a lead weight in his chest. Eleanor, however, was a whirlwind of controlled energy, organizing Elijah's upcoming appointments, her smile a fragile mask over her own uncertainty. The opulence of their home felt suffocating, the polished surfaces reflecting their inner turmoil. One evening, the three of them sat at the large mahogany dining table, a stark contrast to the usual cheerful family dinners. Elijah, unusually quiet, picked at his food. "Elijah, sweetie," Eleanor began, her voice soft. "The doctor needs to run some more tests." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on his plate. Richard watched, his heart clenching. He wanted to reach out, to explain, to somehow alleviate the growing tension, but the words caught in his throat. "It's just a follow-up," Eleanor continued, sensing his hesitation. "Nothing to worry about, darling." Her forced cheerfulness felt brittle, like thin ice over a deep, dark lake. That night, Richard found Eleanor in their bedroom, staring out at the moonlit garden. He approached cautiously, the silence between them thick with unspoken anxieties. He touched her shoulder, a hesitant gesture that spoke volumes of his remorse. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there for you, for him, from the start." Eleanor turned, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not your fault, Richard," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "But this changes everything." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The fear, it's not just for Elijah. It's for us, for our family." She leaned against him, her body shaking slightly. The carefully constructed facade of composure finally cracked, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. The opulent room, with its soft lighting and expensive furnishings, became insignificant. All that mattered was the shared burden, the unspoken fear, the fragility of their newfound family. The moon cast long shadows, blurring the lines between hope and despair, as they held each other, bracing themselves for the storm that was brewing. The stark white of the doctor's office felt colder than usual. Richard sat rigidly, the polished mahogany of the chair a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside him. The doctor's words, a near-perfect match, echoed in his ears, a relentless hammer against the fragile edifice of his life. He stared at his hands, calloused from years of manipulating deals, now trembling with a fear he hadn't known existed. The scent of antiseptic, usually sterile and impersonal, now felt heavy, suffocating. He replayed the doctor's explanation, the medical jargon blurring into a chaotic symphony of disbelief. A genetic marker so rare it was statistically improbable, shared with Elijah, his own son. The irony was a cruel joke. He, the man who'd believed himself barren, was the father of the child he'd adopted. Eleanor's hand reached across the small space between them, her touch gentle but firm. He looked up, meeting her unwavering gaze. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, held a mix of awe and apprehension. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "What do you think?" He swallowed, the lump in his throat making speech difficult. I don't know," he managed, his voice barely a breath. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, crushing him beneath its impossible implications. Years of self-deception, of carefully constructed walls around his heart, were crumbling. A wave of nausea washed over him. He remembered a shadowy figure in his past, a forgotten face, a whispered secret from a long-ago summer, a hidden illness, a diagnosis long since buried under layers of ambition and denial, a past trauma he'd meticulously avoided for decades. The truth was starting to surface, unwelcome and painful. He was a father, but only now, after a lifetime of believing it impossible. His carefully built life, his perfect image, was shattered. The opulence he'd valued so much now felt like a gilded cage. He closed his eyes, trying to breathe, trying to process the overwhelming tide of emotions threatening to engulf him. He was a father. He had a son, and he hadn't been there for him. The guilt was a suffocating weight. He opened his eyes, meeting Eleanor's worried gaze. He had to tell her. He had to tell Elijah. But how? Where did they go from here? The future, once so clearly defined, was now a vast, unexplored landscape shrouded in uncertainty. The drive home was a blur. The sleek lines of their Bentley, usually a source of quiet pride, felt oppressive. Richard stared out at the blurring cityscape, the neon lights a mocking reflection of the chaos within him. Eleanor reached for his hand, her touch a lifeline in the swirling sea of his doubt. He squeezed it, the unexpected warmth a small comfort in the face of the monumental revelation. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. The usually vibrant chatter that filled their car was replaced by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of Richard's heart, a frantic drum against his ribs. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice soft, laced with a tremor of uncertainty. "Richard, we need to talk." He nodded, unable to trust his voice. The sterile scent of the doctor's office still clung to him, a phantom smell of disbelief and dawning dread. He saw flashes of his past, a hazy image of a young boy, his own youthful face, a shadowed figure looming nearby, and a whispered conversation, indecipherable yet laced with an undercurrent of fear. He pulled into their driveway, the grand house suddenly feeling like a cold, imposing fortress. As they entered the opulent foyer, the usual comforting familiarity was gone, replaced by a stark, unsettling emptiness. Elijah, oblivious to the storm brewing within his parents, emerged from the study, a worn book clutched in his hands. His small smile faltered as he saw his parents' strained faces. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Eleanor forced a smile, a fragile thing that couldn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a long day, sweetheart," she said, her voice catching slightly. Richard watched, a wave of guilt washing over him. He had a son he'd never known, a son he'd unknowingly rejected. He needed to tell Elijah. The thought was terrifying yet inescapable. He wanted to explain, to share this extraordinary discovery, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the decades of denial, the self-inflicted pain, and the years of emotional distance? He looked at Elijah, his quiet, intelligent son, his heart aching with a love so profound it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The revelation wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was a seismic shift in the foundations of their family. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Richard, a physical burden. The opulent study, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt claustrophobic. He paced, the Persian rug soft beneath his expensive loafers, offering no comfort. The scent of old leather from his grandfather's chair, a constant in his life, now felt suffocating. Eleanor sat by the window, the city lights painting streaks of silver across her face, her expression unreadable. Elijah, sensing the tension, retreated to a corner, his small body radiating a quiet apprehension. It's hard to believe," Richard finally said, his voice a rough whisper. The words felt inadequate, a paltry attempt to capture the storm raging within him. Eleanor's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of concern and dawning understanding. "I know," she replied, her voice soft. "But it's true, isn't it? The test." He nodded, unable to speak further. The thought of his past, a shrouded, painful past he'd buried deep, rose up like a phantom, its icy fingers clutching at his heart. He remembered his father's cold detachment, the whispered rumors, the sterile atmosphere of his childhood home. This newfound revelation wasn't just a medical miracle. It was a gaping wound in his carefully constructed life. "What do we do now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a breath. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. The future, once a clear path, now seemed a treacherous maze. Elijah, silent until now, spoke in a small voice. Am I really your son, Dad?" His eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a hesitant hope and a deep-seated fear of rejection. Richard's heart splintered. He wanted to rush to his son, to hold him, to reassure him, but the words caught in his throat. The years of emotional distance, the self-imposed barriers, felt insurmountable. He saw his own youthful reflection in Elijah's anxious eyes, a poignant mirror of his own past pain. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock, each tick a hammer blow against his conscience. The truth, once a terrifying secret, now demanded to be shared, and the weight of that responsibility threatened to crush him. He had a son he had unknowingly lost, and now miraculously found again. And the path to reconciliation was daunting and unclear. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Richard's power, now felt like a prison. He sat, the cool, polished surface a stark contrast to the burning heat in his chest. The city lights, blurred through the rain-streaked window, mirrored the confusion swirling within him. He picked up a silver pen, its weight strangely comforting, twisting it between his numb fingers. Eleanor watched him, her silence more potent than any outburst. The unspoken question hung heavy. How could they possibly navigate this? "It's impossible," Richard finally whispered, the words catching in his throat. The denial, a shield he'd built around his heart, began to crumble. He saw Elijah in the doorway, his silhouette a fragile shadow against the hall's soft light. The boy's eyes, usually so bright, were clouded with a cautious hope. "Dad!" Elijah's voice was barely audible. Richard swallowed, the lump in his throat making the simple word impossible. He rose, the chair scraping against the polished floor, a jarring sound in the tense silence. He walked toward Elijah, his steps hesitant, unsure. The years of emotional detachment felt like an ocean separating them. Yet, in Elijah's hesitant gaze, he saw a reflection of his own youthful pain, a mirror to a past he'd long tried to forget. "Son," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion, "there's something we need to talk about." He knelt, his expensive suit feeling strangely out of place on the plush carpet. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, the simple words feeling as heavy as millstones. He longed to hold his son, to reassure him, but fear held him back, the fear of breaking something precious, something newly found. He had a son he'd never known, a son fate had somehow returned to him. But how could he bridge the chasm of years, the silence of decades, to embrace this miraculous reality? The sterile white of the clinic seemed to amplify the silence. Richard stared at the genetic report, the stark black print blurring through his unshed tears. The air hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. Eleanor, usually a whirlwind of activity, sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the expensive silk of her dress crinkling with each subtle movement. The scent of antiseptic fought with the faint perfume she always wore, a heady mix that mirrored the volatile emotions simmering beneath the surface. "It's confirmed," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't need to elaborate. The confirmation, the undeniable truth of the genetic match, hung between them like a tangible thing. Richard swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his denial. He looked at the city sprawling outside the window, a glittering tapestry of lights that offered no solace. The memories flooded back, a youthful recklessness, a careless mistake, a life-altering diagnosis that had shattered his dreams. He'd built a life on the foundation of that loss, a life of success, of wealth, but ultimately of emptiness. Now, that emptiness was cracking, revealing a wellspring of unexpected emotion. How could this happen? He finally managed, his voice a low rasp. The question wasn't directed at Eleanor. It was a desperate plea for understanding, a search for answers within himself. Eleanor reached out, her hand covering his. Her touch, usually light and playful, was firm, unwavering. "It's a miracle, Richard," she said softly, her voice tinged with a fragile hope. "A miracle we've been given this chance." She squeezed his hand, a silent reassurance in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. But her gaze, though loving, held a flicker of something else. A subtle apprehension about the implications of this revelation. A quiet fear for the delicate balance of their newfound family. The weight of Richard's past, the potential disruption to their carefully constructed world, was a silent shadow hanging over her joy. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city, a counterpoint to the storm raging within them. The future, once so clearly defined, now lay before them, a vast and uncharted territory, fraught with both immense joy and terrifying uncertainty. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations and whispered anxieties. The sterile scent of the clinic lingered in Richard's memory, clinging to the crisp cotton sheets of his bed. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a chaotic jumble of fragmented memories, shadowy figures from a past he'd tried to bury. He saw his younger self, reckless and carefree, a stark contrast to the controlled, successful man he'd become. Eleanor, ever practical, organized further testing. The opulent silence of their home, usually a comfort, felt oppressive. The sunlight, once welcoming, now seemed to highlight the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny reminder of the precariousness of their situation. One evening, sitting on their sun-drenched terrace, overlooking their meticulously manicured gardens, the weight of it all crashed down on Richard. The scent of jasmine, usually a source of calm, only amplified his inner turmoil. He poured himself a large brandy, the amber liquid swirling in the glass like a miniature vortex of his unsettled emotions. "It's real, isn't it?" he finally said, his voice rough. Eleanor, knitting by his side, paused. The rhythmic click of her needles ceased, leaving a silence heavy with unspoken fears. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of concern and unwavering support. "The tests confirm it, Richard. Elijah is your son." "My son," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "After all these years, I thought—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the years of self-deception, the carefully constructed wall of denial he'd built around himself. Eleanor took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "It's a lot to process," she said softly. Her voice, though calm, betrayed a tremor of anxiety. The happiness she'd felt at the initial revelation was now tinged with a hesitant fear. The quiet joy that had filled their lives with Elijah's arrival was now overshadowed by the potential upheaval this discovery could bring. "But we'll face it together, Richard. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Her eyes held a depth of emotion that moved him profoundly. The fear wasn't just for their family. It was for him, a reflection of his own internal struggle. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a beautiful but distant spectacle. Richard stared at them, the glittering tapestry no longer a symbol of his success, but a reminder of the life he had built upon a lie. He knew that confronting his past was no longer a choice, but a necessity, the first step towards a future that was both terrifying and intensely hopeful. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. They would navigate stormy seas, but together, they would find their way. The following days were a blur of hushed phone calls and hushed anxieties. Richard felt the weight of the news settle heavily on his chest, a physical pressure that stole his breath. He revisited the sterile white examination room in his mind, the sharp scent of antiseptic clinging to the memory. Even the luxurious silk sheets of his bed felt rough against his skin. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, navigated the whirlwind of further tests, her efficiency a stark contrast to Richard's internal turmoil. Their sprawling home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage, its opulent silence amplifying the echoing dread within. Sunlight, once a welcome warmth, now seemed to expose every imperfection. Every dust mote a symbol of the precariousness of their new reality. One evening, perched on their terrace, the scent of jasmine heavy in the night air, Richard finally broke. The usual calm of the meticulously landscaped gardens offered no solace. He poured himself a generous brandy, the amber liquid swirling in his glass like a miniature storm. "It's real, isn't it?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. Eleanor, knitting nearby, stopped the rhythmic click of her needles. The silence that followed hung heavy, pregnant with unspoken fears. She looked at him, her gaze a mixture of concern and fierce loyalty. "The tests confirm it, Richard. Elijah is your son." The words hung in the air, heavy and momentous. Richard stared at his brandy, the amber liquid reflecting the city lights twinkling in the distance, a glittering spectacle that held no joy for him tonight. "My son," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. After all these years, I thought. He trailed off, the unspoken years of self-deception, of carefully constructed denial, hanging heavy between them. Eleanor reached for his hand, her touch firm, reassuring. "It's a lot to process," she said softly, her voice betraying a tremor of anxiety. The initial joy was now replaced by a hesitant fear, a worry that mirrored the tempest brewing inside Richard. "But we'll face it together, Richard. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Her unwavering support, a beacon in his storm, offered a glimmer of hope. He saw the fear in her eyes are not just for their family, but for him a reflection of his own internal struggle. The city lights seemed to mock his past success, transforming from symbols of achievement into reminders of the life he built on a carefully constructed lie. The journey ahead felt fraught with danger, but her words, her presence, were a lifeline. He knew confronting his past wasn't a choice. It was a necessity, the first step towards a future that was both terrifying and profoundly hopeful. The sterile scent of the hospital lingered on Richard's clothes, a phantom smell clinging to him even after showering. He sat at his mahogany desk, the polished surface reflecting his grim face. The official report lay open, the stark medical terminology a stark contrast to the ornate carvings on the desk. Eleanor entered, her usually bright eyes shadowed with concern. The opulent room, usually a symbol of their success, felt suffocating. "They've confirmed it," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper above the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. She moved to sit beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The touch, usually comforting, felt strained. Richard nodded, unable to speak. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, a physical burden heavier than any business deal. He thought of his carefully constructed life, the years of denial, the calculated success built on a foundation of unspoken lies. He looked at the report, his gaze fixed on Elijah's name. The boy, his son, a child he'd never known existed. "It's a lot," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to express the maelstrom within him. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I know, but we have Elijah, and we have each other." Her voice held a tremor, a hint of uncertainty beneath the brave facade. She too was grappling with the implications, the seismic shift in their lives. The meticulously planned future was shattered, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. Richard stared out the window, the city sprawling beneath them like a concrete jungle. The shimmering lights, once symbols of his achievements, now mocked him. His meticulously constructed life, the life he believed he deserved, felt fragile, built on quicksand. He glanced at Eleanor, her face etched with worry, and for a moment, the self-imposed armor he'd worn for so long cracked. "I never wanted to be this selfish," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. The words hung between them, heavy with regret. He looked at Eleanor and saw her gaze fixed on him with a mix of fear and understanding. "It's not too late, Richard," she said softly. "We can still fix things." The words resonated, a small spark of hope in the darkness. He knew the journey ahead was long and arduous, fraught with challenges, but he also knew, with a certainty that surprised even himself, that he would face them, not alone. He looked at Eleanor, and his heart, for the first time in a long time, felt a flicker of something other than cold, calculated ambition. Love. A fierce, protective love for both Eleanor and the son he had just discovered. The scent of old paper and dust clung to the air in Richard's ancestral home, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital. He stood in the library, sunlight slanting through the tall arched windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust. Rows upon rows of leather-bound books, silent witnesses to generations past, lined the walls. He ran a hand along a spine, the embossed gold lettering cool beneath his fingertips. This was where he'd sought refuge as a boy, escaping a childhood he now felt compelled to unearth. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, its pendulum a metronome counting down to an uncertain future. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. His grandfather's handwriting, elegant and precise, filled the pages. He scanned the entries, his eyes searching for clues, for a mention of his own mother, a woman he barely remembered. A name, a date, a fleeting glimpse of a life lived in shadow. He found it, a cryptic entry detailing a hidden pregnancy, a hasty departure, a secret kept for decades. His breath hitched in his throat. The sterile pronouncements of the doctors suddenly felt insignificant against the weight of this revelation. A secret his family had held tight for years. He felt a tremor, a physical manifestation of the emotional earthquake tearing through him. He reread the passage, the words blurring through his tears. The truth was far more complex than he'd ever imagined. The perceived sterility, the years of longing, the carefully constructed life of success, all of it suddenly felt like a meticulously crafted illusion. He closed the journal with a soft thud, the sound echoing the quiet collapse of his self-constructed world. He needed to talk to Eleanor. He needed to share this crushing weight, this newfound history, with the woman who had become his anchor in the storm. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with uncertainty, but he also knew that he wouldn't be traversing it alone. He would face whatever came next, hand in hand with his wife, with the child who had unknowingly reunited him with his past. The drive home was a blur, the city lights smearing into streaks of color through Richard's rain-streaked windshield. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, his mind replaying his grandfather's words. Asterisk, a hasty departure. A secret kept for decades. Asterisk, the sterile clinical environment of the hospital felt a lifetime away, replaced by a suffocating weight of revelation. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent question in her eyes. The opulent silence of their car, usually a haven, now felt like a pressure cooker. Richard, Eleanor finally spoke, her voice soft, hesitant. What did you find? He glanced at her, the worry etched on her face mirroring his own turmoil. The years of carefully constructed normalcy, the comfortable lie of his infertility, crumbled under the weight of this newly unearthed truth. More than I ever expected, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. A secret, a hidden child, my child. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Eleanor's hand tightened on his arm. He saw a flicker of fear, but beneath it, a resilience that both surprised and comforted him. And your mother? She asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. He shook his head, the image of the brittle journal pages flashing before his eyes. I don't know. The journal, it only hints at her. A name, a date, a life lived in shadows. The silence returned, deeper now, laced with the unspoken question of how they would navigate this uncharted territory. The luxury of their home, usually a symbol of their success, felt oppressive, suffocating. He needed answers not just for himself, but for Elijah, the boy who had unknowingly brought them to this precipice. The truth felt like a fragile thing, capable of shattering their lives with one careless touch. He knew they would face this together, hand in hand, but the path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty. He just hoped it wouldn't tear them apart. The old Victorian house, usually a sanctuary, felt like a mausoleum. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon sun, slanting through the stained glass window, illuminating the intricate carvings on the mahogany desk where Richard sat, hunched over a faded photograph. It showed a young woman with eyes like Elijah's, dark, luminous, full of a sadness that mirrored the ache in his own heart. His grandfather, a man he barely knew, was a ghost in the background, a stiff figure in a tailored suit. Eleanor entered softly, her footsteps barely disturbing the quietude. She carried a steaming mug, the scent of chamomile momentarily pushing back the suffocating weight of the past. Richard, she began, her voice gentle. You haven't eaten anything all day. He didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the woman in the photo. I need to understand, he murmured, his voice rough with unshed tears. I need to know who she was. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand finding his. The touch was a lifeline, a grounding force in the whirlwind of his emotions. We'll find out, she said, her voice unwavering despite the tremor in her own heart. Together, but maybe we should focus on Elijah for a little while? The mention of their son brought him back to the present. He looked at her, seeing the worry etched deep in her lines, the unspoken fear that mirrored his own. The weight of his secret, the potential impact on Elijah, crushed him. He swallowed, the lump in his throat thick with emotion. "You're right," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We need to be careful to protect him. This could break him." He closed his eyes, the image of Elijah's trusting face burning into his mind. The guilt was a physical presence, a lead weight in his chest. This wasn't just about uncovering his past. It was about safeguarding his son's future. He had to proceed with caution, for Elijah's sake, for their family's sake. The journey had just begun. The musty scent of aged paper and leather filled Richard's study as he sifted through a trunk overflowing with his father's belongings. Each item, a worn leather-bound journal, a tarnished silver locket, a faded photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes, felt like a shard of a forgotten past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. He felt a tremor of anxiety, a prickling sensation on his skin as he pulled out a bundle of letters, tied with a frayed ribbon. Eleanor found him there, hours later, the letters scattered across the desk like fallen leaves. He hadn't spoken a word since she'd left him earlier. He looked gaunt, his face drawn and pale under the harsh light. The silence was thick with unspoken questions, anxieties swirling between them like a silent storm. "Richard," Eleanor whispered, her voice soft as a feather against the heavy air. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. He flinched at first, then allowed her hand to rest on his. The contact seemed to ground him, pulling him back from the swirling vortex of his memories. "I found them," he said, his voice hoarse, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He picked up a letter, the paper brittle with age. "Letters from my mother." He began to read, his voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as he delved deeper into the words. The story of a young, unmarried mother who'd made a difficult choice, a choice that echoed in the present. His heart pounded in his chest. Each sentence was a revelation, a painful yet necessary unveiling of a long-hidden truth. Eleanor listened intently, her gaze fixed on Richard, her face a mixture of concern and quiet understanding. The words painted a picture of a love affair, a secret pregnancy, a forced adoption. The woman in the photograph from earlier was revealed to be his mother. The pain in Richard's voice deepened with each word, a raw, visceral exposure of regret and sorrow. The final letter spoke of a rare genetic marker, the same one Elijah possessed. It was a twist of fate, a cruel irony that had brought father and son together through a path neither of them could have ever imagined. As he finished, a sob escaped Richard's lips. The weight of the past seemed to lift slightly, replaced by an aching hope. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes brimming with tears. "She loved me," he whispered, the words a soft exhale of pain and peace. The silence in their bedroom stretched, thick and heavy as the velvet curtains drawn against the encroaching twilight. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, a small, fragile figure against the opulent silk sheets, her gaze fixed on the ornate Persian rug. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, suffocating. Richard paced, the polished wood floor echoing softly with each step, his shadow a restless phantom against the wall. The weight of their decision hung between them, unspoken, yet palpable. "We can't keep this from him," Eleanor finally said, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. The single tear that traced a path down her cheek reflected the internal storm raging within. Richard stopped pacing, his back to her, his shoulders slumped with weariness. The knowledge of his past, unearthed from the dusty letters, felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "But how do we tell him? How do we explain this twist of fate?" His voice was rough, raw with emotion. Eleanor turned, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Honestly, Richard, with as much love and care as we can muster, he deserves to know the truth, no matter how difficult it is. She reached out, her hand resting on his arm, a silent gesture of support. The cool touch of her skin momentarily steadied his trembling. He turned to her, his gaze searching hers. And what if he hates me? What if he blames me for everything, for the years he spent without knowing me? The fear in his eyes was stark, raw. The opulent surroundings seemed to shrink, the gilded cage of their wealth suddenly feeling claustrophobic. He won't, Eleanor said softly, her voice unwavering. Elijah is a good boy, Richard. He's resilient, and he loves you. I see it every day in the small gestures, the quiet moments. She squeezed his arm gently. We'll do this together. We'll face this together. The weight of the shared responsibility settled between them, a heavy yet strangely comforting burden. The decision had been made. The revelation was imminent, a storm of emotion waiting to break. The opulent silence of their bedroom, for a moment, held the fragile promise of a new dawn. The following morning, the opulent breakfast room felt strangely sterile. The usual cheerful chatter of the staff was muted, replaced by a nervous quiet that mirrored the tension simmering between Eleanor and Richard. Sunlight, filtering through the stained glass windows, cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished mahogany table, but neither of them noticed. Richard, usually so impeccably groomed, looked haggard, his expensive suit rumpled. He picked listlessly at a perfectly ripe peach, its juicy sweetness lost on him. I need to see Dr. Albright again, he finally said, his voice rough around the edges. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Eleanor, who had been quietly observing him, reached across the table, her hand covering his. Her touch was surprisingly firm, a silent reassurance. Of course, dear, we need all the confirmation we can get. A faint tremor in her voice betrayed the uncertainty she felt. The weight of their secret, the potential shattering of their carefully constructed family, threatened to overwhelm them both. The drive to the doctor's office felt interminable. Each passing mile stretched the already taut silence between them, filling the luxurious car with a suffocating anxiety. Richard stared out the window, the passing landscape a blur of greens and browns, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Guilt gnawed at him, a deep, visceral ache for the years lost with Elijah. He hadn't even known he had a son, hadn't been given the chance to be a father. The sterile lab, the cold clinical lights, the impersonal feel of the medical equipment only amplified the sense of unease that had settled over him like a shroud. The doctor's words, when they came, were swift and unequivocal, confirming the genetic link beyond any doubt. The confirmation hit Richard like a physical blow, leaving him breathless and reeling. Eleanor, however, seemed strangely calm. A quiet strength held her together, a steady beacon in the storm that raged within Richard. We need to think about Elijah, she said softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the tempest in his soul. How we tell him when we tell him what he might need. The question hung between them, a silent promise to face this new reality together. The opulent comfort of their life, once a source of pride, felt brittle, fragile. In the face of this life-altering revelation, the journey toward truth had just begun. The drive home was a blur. Richard stared out the window, the manicured lawns and pristine houses of their wealthy neighborhood mocking the turmoil within him. Eleanor's hand, resting on his arm, was a lifeline in the churning sea of his emotions. The silence in the car wasn't tense, exactly. It was heavy, laden with the unspoken weight of their secret. It's a lot to process, Richard finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't need to specify what it was. Eleanor understood. She squeezed his arm gently. Yes, it is. But we'll face this together, Richard. We always have. Her voice, though calm, held a hint of tremor that mirrored his own inner chaos. He appreciated her strength. It was a stark contrast to his own unraveling. That evening, their opulent home felt alien. The soft glow of the fireplace, usually a source of comfort, seemed to accentuate the emptiness they felt. They sat on the plush sofa, the distance between them a chasm wider than the grand hall separating their bedroom from the drawing room. "How do we tell Elijah?" Richard finally asked, the question hanging in the air like a fragile crystal ball, threatening to shatter at the slightest touch. The fear in his voice was palpable. He had longed for a child, yet now that his son had been revealed, he felt utterly unprepared. Eleanor sighed, the sound a soft rustling in the quiet room. "I don't know, Richard, but we have to do it right. We have to be ready for everything." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "We have to tell him together." The unspoken understanding between them was a fragile bond, holding them together in the face of a potentially devastating revelation. The luxurious surroundings, once a testament to their success, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them in a reality far more complex than they could have ever imagined. The comfortable silence that had once defined their life was gone, replaced by a tense, quiet expectation that was almost physically painful. The following days were a blur of hushed phone calls, hurried consultations, and the gnawing weight of their secret. Richard, usually the picture of controlled composure, found himself pacing their expansive living room, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet. The silence in the house, once comforting, now felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. Eleanor, ever the pillar of strength, observed him with a mixture of concern and quiet understanding. She saw the fragility beneath his carefully constructed facade, the tremor in his hands as he held a lukewarm cup of tea, the way his eyes darted nervously to the hallway leading to Elijah's room. "He's happy?" Richard finally said one evening, the words escaping him in a ragged breath, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. "So happy. And I don't know how to." His voice trailed off, unable to articulate the fear that threatened to consume him. The weight of his impending confession pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. Eleanor moved closer, her hand resting on his. "We'll do it together," she whispered, her voice a soft balm against his turmoil. "We'll find the right words, the right time. We'll face this together, just like we always have." Her words were a lifeline, a promise in the face of the unknown. That night, unable to sleep, Richard found himself drawn to Elijah's room. He stood in the doorway watching his son sleep, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the gentle curve of his lashes, the innocent serenity on his face. All of it struck him with a force that left him breathless. This child, sleeping peacefully, was his blood, a part of him he'd never known. The weight of his past mistakes, the years of self-imposed isolation, now felt crushing. He longed to reach out, to hold his son, to tell him the truth, but fear still held him back. The next morning, they met with the genetic counselor. The confirmation was stark, undeniable. The probability of Richard being Elijah's biological father was astonishingly high. Leaving the clinic, Richard felt numb, the sunlight seemingly muted, the city sounds distant and unreal. Eleanor, sensing his distress, held his hand tightly. "We need to tell him," she said quietly, her voice unwavering. Soon, the decision hung between them, a heavy cloud threatening to break open. The fear, once confined to Richard, now spread, a chilling tendril enveloping them both. The path forward was uncertain, terrifying, but they had to walk it, together. The sun, a pale disk behind swirling gray clouds, cast long shadows across Elijah's brightly painted bedroom. Richard knelt beside the bed, the worn wooden floorboards cool against his knees. Elijah, oblivious to his father's silent vigil, slept soundly, his dark lashes resting on cheeks the color of warm cinnamon. The scent of lavender from his pillow drifted towards Richard, a subtle fragrance that unexpectedly tugged at something deep within him. He reached out, his finger tracing the delicate line of Elijah's brow. The touch was hesitant, almost reverent. This small, sleeping child held the key to a past Richard had buried deep, a past that now threatened to unravel everything he knew. "Ready," Eleanor's voice, soft as the whisper of wind through leaves, broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, her expression a blend of apprehension and unwavering support. Richard swallowed, his throat tight. "As I'll ever be," he managed, his voice a rough rasp. He felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in his stomach, a cold dread that threatened to overwhelm him. He looked at Eleanor, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty, the same daunting weight of their decision. Yet, in her gaze, he saw something more: unwavering love, a fierce determination to navigate this together. It was a comfort, a lifeline in the storm brewing within him. Taking a deep breath, Richard pulled himself to his feet. The moment was here. There was no turning back. He looked at his son, sleeping so peacefully, a small hand curled loosely at his side. The weight of his secret, the years of silence, felt as if it would crush him. But in the silence of the room, in the soft rise and fall of his son's chest, a new feeling began to bloom, not just fear, but a hesitant, aching love, raw and unfamiliar, yet undeniably potent. He was ready. He had to be. The air in the room hung thick with unspoken words. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass window, painted kaleidoscopic patterns across Elijah's face. He sat on the edge of his bed, small shoulders hunched, clutching a worn teddy bear. The scent of lavender, clinging to his pajamas, mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of fear. "So, it means you're my dad?" Elijah's voice, barely a whisper, broke the tense silence. His eyes, the same deep brown as Richard's, were wide with a confusion that mirrored the turmoil in Richard's own heart. Richard knelt, his gaze locked on his son's. The weight of years of lies, of omissions, pressed down on him. He reached out, his hand hovering over Elijah's before finally settling gently on his shoulder. The warmth of his son's skin, surprisingly soft against his palm, sent a jolt through him. "Yes, son," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "It means, you're my son." The words, so simple, felt monumental, laden with the weight of a lifetime's regret. Eleanor watched them, a silent observer in the drama unfolding before her. Her heart ached for both of them, for the complexities of their newly revealed relationship. She saw the raw vulnerability etched on Richard's face, a vulnerability she'd rarely witnessed in their years together. "But, Mom?" Elijah's question hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two worlds. The unspoken question, the elephant in the room, was a heavy one. The concept of a mother he'd never known, the potential for a family he'd never had, hung heavy in the air. Richard felt Eleanor's hand on his back, a silent gesture of support, a testament to their shared journey. "We'll tell you everything, Elijah," Eleanor said softly, her voice laced with a quiet strength that calmed the storm brewing within their son. "Everything we know." The unspoken weight of what they didn't know, the mysteries still swirling around Elijah's origins, rested heavily on her shoulders. She knew that this was just the beginning of a long, complicated journey, a journey they would face together. The fear in Elijah's eyes began to be replaced with the slow blossoming of curiosity. A tiny shift in the atmosphere, a fragile light in the darkness. The room, moments ago filled with fear, now held the faintest trace of hope. The following days were a blur of hushed conversations and tentative smiles. Elijah, initially withdrawn, gradually opened up, peppering them with questions, his small hands gripping Richard's. The grand living room, usually echoing with polished silence, now hummed with a low, comforting murmur. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. It felt different now, warmer, imbued with a newfound intimacy. "So, does this mean I have a grandma?" he asked one evening, curled up on the vast sofa, his gaze fixed on a flickering fire. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the subtle fragrance of Eleanor's lavender perfume. Richard hesitated. Uncovering his past meant unearthing a painful truth, one he'd buried for years. "We don't know yet, son," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, stroking Elijah's hair, the soft strands surprisingly familiar beneath his fingers. The act felt strangely natural, a connection forged across years of separation. Eleanor watched them, a bittersweet ache in her chest. She'd loved Elijah unconditionally from the moment they brought him home, but this revelation shifted the landscape of their family. A pang of something akin to jealousy. No, not jealousy, but a profound sense of displacement tugged at her heart. She knew she had to work on setting that aside. Their family would need her strength. "We're going to find out," she said, her voice firm, a reassuring anchor in the swirling uncertainty. "Together, we'll find out everything we can about your past." That night, in the quiet sanctuary of their bedroom, Eleanor and Richard faced each other, the weight of their secret heavy between them. The luxurious silk sheets felt cold against their skin, a stark contrast to the warmth that had begun to bloom between Richard and Elijah. "It's a lot to process," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. I failed him for so long." Eleanor reached out, her fingers intertwining with his. "You didn't know, Richard, and now you're here. That's all that matters." Her words, though comforting, held a subtle undercurrent of unspoken anxieties. The future held many unknowns, many challenges, but they faced them together. The quiet strength of their love, a silent promise, filled the silence. The news hung heavy in the air, a tangible presence in the spacious, sun-drenched playroom. Elijah, perched on a brightly colored beanbag chair, stared at his hands, his small fingers tracing the intricate patterns woven into the fabric. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Richard watched him, a mixture of guilt and profound love twisting in his gut. He'd imagined this moment countless times, yet the reality was far more delicate, more fraught with emotion than he could have anticipated. "So, it's true," Elijah finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the ticking clock. His gaze remained fixed on his hands, as if afraid to meet Richard's eyes. Richard swallowed, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. "Yes, son," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "It's true. You're my son." Eleanor knelt beside Elijah, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The warmth of her touch seemed to ground him, a reassuring presence amidst the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "We're so glad you're ours, Elijah," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Always have been, always will be." Her words were sincere, yet a shadow of uncertainty flickered in her eyes. The fear of displacement, of being less essential, still lingered, a subtle dissonance in her unwavering love. Elijah looked up at them, his eyes filled with a complex mix of confusion and wonder. The sunlight caught the tears welling up in his eyes, making them sparkle like tiny, precious gems. "But, my mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. The question hung in the air, unspoken anxieties attached to it like tiny, clinging burrs. The question of his biological mother, a woman he'd never met, a woman whose existence had irrevocably altered his life, loomed large. It was a question that would demand answers, answers that would redefine their family forever. The path ahead, though uncertain, was one they would walk together. The warmth of the sun in the playroom seemed to dim slightly as the weight of their journey sank in. The mahogany conference table felt cold beneath Richard's palms. He stared at the lawyer's crisp, legal documents, the stark white paper a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood did little to soothe his frayed nerves. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand a silent anchor in his, her knuckles white. The lawyer, a woman with a shrewd gaze and a voice like polished steel, explained the complexities of adoption law, the potential legal challenges of their situation. The words washed over Richard, a meaningless tide against the shore of his fear. "The media, they're sniffing around," the lawyer stated, her tone devoid of sympathy. "We need to prepare for a potential onslaught." Eleanor stiffened, her gaze hardening. "We'll protect Elijah," she stated, her voice firm. a protective shield around the fragile family unit, the image of their son, his small face etched with confusion and fear, flashed through Richard's mind. He'd never felt such a fierce protectiveness, a burning need to shield his child from the world's harsh glare. The lawyer continued, outlining strategies for managing press inquiries, emphasizing the importance of controlled messaging, the necessity of legal counsel. Richard listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He envisioned the headlines, the flashing cameras, the invasion of their privacy. The opulent security of their home suddenly felt like a flimsy barrier against an approaching storm. He felt a suffocating wave of guilt. This was his fault. His secret, his past, had thrust them into this maelstrom. He looked at Eleanor, her face pale but resolute. Her unwavering support was a lifeline in this tumultuous sea. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise to navigate this storm together. For Elijah's sake, he would face whatever came, shoulder to shoulder with her, protecting their family, their fragile new reality. The lawyer's voice faded into the background, a droning hum of legal jargon. All that mattered was their son. All that mattered was their family, and their fight to protect them. The lawyer's words hung in the air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and impending doom. Richard felt a tremor run through Eleanor's hand, a silent earthquake mirroring the one raging inside him. The mahogany table, usually a symbol of their power and success, felt like a cold, unyielding prison. He squeezed her hand, his knuckles bone white. "We'll handle this," he murmured, the words barely audible above the lawyer's continuing explanation of media strategies and legal maneuvering. Outside, the Los Angeles sun beat down on their manicured lawns, a mocking contrast to the storm brewing within their lives. The vast expanse of their property, usually a sanctuary of peace, now felt like a gilded cage. But what if they find out about everything? Eleanor's voice, usually so calm and composed, trembled slightly. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own. This wasn't just about their wealth or reputation. It was about Elijah, their precious son. Richard swallowed, the lump in his throat thick with guilt. "We won't let them," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. He had to be strong for Eleanor, for Elijah. He had to face the consequences of his hidden past, a past that had unexpectedly collided with his present, shattering the carefully constructed facade of his life. He thought of Elijah, his son's sweet face, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. The thought fueled his resolve, a fierce protectiveness surging through him. He would fight for his family, for this unexpected, deeply cherished love. "We'll control the narrative," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "We'll tell our story on our terms." He looked at Eleanor, seeing the fear slowly replaced by a steely determination. He saw a reflection of his own resolve in her eyes, a fierce protective mother mirroring his own protectiveness as a father. Together they would face the storm. Together they would protect their son. The lawyer's voice faded into the background, a low hum of legal strategy. All that mattered was the love they shared, the family they had found, and the fight to protect it. The following day brought a flurry of activity. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Chan, buzzed around their home like a hummingbird, her crisp suits and efficient manner a stark contrast to the chaos brewing within. Richard, pacing the sun-drenched terrace, felt the weight of the world pressing down. The scent of jasmine from the meticulously maintained garden did little to soothe his anxiety. He watched Eleanor, her usually vibrant energy subdued, gently coaxing Elijah into a game of chess. The familiar click of the chess pieces, a comforting rhythm in their usually ordered lives, felt discordant now. "Richard," Eleanor's voice, soft but firm, pulled him from his thoughts. She stood at the French doors, her face etched with a mixture of worry and determination. The morning sun glinted on the delicate gold chain around her neck, a gift from Richard, a symbol of their enduring love, now overshadowed by uncertainty. "They want a statement," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the gentle breeze rustling through the palm trees. "They want to control the narrative, but we can't let them. We need to tell our story on our own terms, for Elijah's sake." He nodded, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. I know, but how? How do we explain all this? How do we protect him? He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. The carefully constructed facade of their lives, the perfect picture they had presented to the world, was crumbling. Eleanor walked towards him, her steps slow and deliberate. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch a silent reassurance. "We'll figure it out together," she said, her voice steady, strong. "For Elijah, for us." Her gaze, usually so warm and loving, held a steely resolve, reflecting the strength he admired, the strength he now needed to match. The sun, once a mocking reminder of their gilded cage, now felt like a silent witness to their shared determination, a promise of a brighter future, however uncertain. The scent of jasmine, still present, now held a note of resilience, a testament to their unwavering love, ready to face whatever storm lay ahead. The lawyer's words hung in the air, sharp and precise, like shards of glass. "The media is relentless, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. A gag order is unlikely. We need a strategy, a controlled release of information." The sterile office, smelling faintly of lemon polish and expensive coffee, felt suffocating. Richard felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a physical manifestation of his anxiety. He glanced at Eleanor, her face pale but resolute, her hand resting reassuringly on Elijah's small one. The boy sat quietly, his usually bright eyes clouded with a worry that mirrored his parents' own. "Controlled release?" Richard echoed, his voice barely a whisper. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, the carefully constructed image of their perfect family cracking under the strain. He looked at Elijah, his son, his blood, a connection he'd never dreamt possible. The thought of this precious, fragile life being tossed into the maelstrom of public scrutiny filled him with a rage he'd never known. Eleanor squeezed Elijah's hand, her touch conveying strength and silent reassurance. "We won't let them hurt him," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chin. "We'll tell our story truthfully, but on our terms." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mahogany conference table, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. Richard felt a surge of anger, a protective fury that ignited within him, burning away some of his fear. He had always been a man of control, a man who built his empire brick by brick. Now, the foundations of his meticulously crafted life were crumbling, and he would fight to rebuild them, stronger than before, for his son. "Ms. Chan," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "Prepare a statement. We'll tell the truth, but we'll control the narrative. We will protect Elijah." The weight of responsibility, previously a crushing burden, now felt like a challenge, a test of his strength, a testament to his love for his family. The scent of lemon polish, previously irritating, now somehow felt like a symbol of the fresh start they would create amidst the chaos. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Richard's hands, the polished surface reflecting the strained faces around it. The lawyer's words, though carefully chosen, felt like blows. Outside, the city thrummed, a relentless pulse echoing the turmoil within him. He stole a glance at Eleanor. Her usual radiance dimmed, replaced by a fierce determination that both comforted and worried him. Elijah, nestled between them, clutched a worn wooden toy car, his small fingers white against the smooth grain. "It's not just the media," Eleanor said, her voice soft but unwavering. "It's everything. Our life, the way things were." She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the vast, empty expanse of their living room. A space that once felt expansive now felt suffocating. The opulent furniture, the priceless artwork, seemed to mock their current fragility. Richard felt a pang of guilt. He'd built this life, this empire of success, only to find it crumbling around them. The sterile perfection he'd craved was now a stark reminder of the emotional emptiness he'd carried for so long. He reached out, covering Eleanor's hand with his, the warmth of her skin a grounding anchor in the storm of his emotions. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. He looked at Elijah, his son, the boy who had unknowingly reunited him with a part of himself he'd buried deep. The boy looked up, his large, dark eyes reflecting the apprehension in the room. "Will I have to leave?" Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The question, so small, yet carried a weight of fear that resonated in the silence. Richard's heart ached. The thought of Elijah, innocent and vulnerable, caught in the crossfire of his past and present, ignited a burning protectiveness within him. He drew Elijah closer, enveloping the boy in a hug, the scent of his hair, a familiar comforting blend of soap and earth, filling his senses. "No, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not going anywhere. We're a family, and we'll face this together. We'll tell our story, our truth, and we will protect you." Eleanor nodded, tears tracing paths down her cheeks. The city's relentless hum outside faded into the background as the three of them held each other, finding solace in the shared warmth of their love, a love that transcended blood and circumstance. The battle for their family's future had begun. The lawyer's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sunlight, muted by the thick, velvet curtains, cast long shadows across the polished mahogany. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars clung to the air, a stark contrast to the tremor in Eleanor's hand as she reached for her glass of water. Its icy chill did little to soothe the burning anxiety that clenched her chest. "They want a statement," the lawyer repeated, his tone carefully neutral, yet his eyes held a flicker of concern. "A public one. They believe a press conference will mitigate the damage." Richard's jaw tightened. The idea of exposing their private lives, their fragile new family, to the ravenous maw of the media filled him with a cold dread. He glanced at Elijah, who sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. The boy's usual playful energy had been replaced by a subdued stillness that mirrored the heavy silence in the room. "We need to consider Elijah," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. The tremor in her voice betrayed the turmoil within. She looked at Richard, her eyes pleading. "His safety, his well-being, it has to be our priority." Richard nodded, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the exhaustion that gnawed at him. The opulent surroundings, once a source of pride, now felt like a gilded cage. The vastness of the room mocked their current vulnerability, amplifying the fear that coiled in his gut. He thought of his past, the years of sterile silence, the crushing weight of his perceived infertility. Now, the truth, a bittersweet revelation, threatened to shatter the delicate peace they'd found. "We won't let them hurt him," Richard said, his voice firmer now, a resolve hardening his features. "We will control the narrative. We'll tell our story on our terms." He looked at Elijah, offering a small, reassuring smile. The boy returned the smile, a flicker of hope in his dark eyes. The city lights twinkled outside, a distant, glittering backdrop to their private struggle. The battle for their family's future was far from over, but in that moment, huddled together in the opulent silence of their home, they found a strength born of love and shared determination, a strength that promised to carry them through the storm ahead. The warmth of their joined hands, the gentle touch of Richard's arm around Elijah's shoulders, offered a small measure of comfort in the face of the unknown. The lawyer's words echoed in the cavernous silence of Richard's study, a space usually filled with the comforting hum of power and success, now thick with the suffocating weight of their predicament. The scent of aged leather and mahogany, usually a source of quiet comfort, felt oppressive. Richard's gaze drifted to the antique globe spinning slowly on his desk, its miniature continents a stark contrast to the vast, unpredictable landscape of his current reality. "A press conference?" Eleanor repeated, her voice brittle. The crystal glass in her hand trembled, mirroring the tremor in her voice. The ice clinked softly, a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging within her. She felt a profound sense of violation, the intrusion into their carefully constructed haven, the threat to their newly formed family. Elijah, perched on a plush velvet armchair, traced patterns on the worn leather with a listless finger. His usual vibrant energy was muted, replaced by a quiet apprehension that tugged at Eleanor's heart. He was 8, too young to comprehend the full weight of the impending media frenzy, yet old enough to sense the shift in the atmosphere, the tightening of the adults' faces. "They're vultures," Richard muttered, his voice rough. The carefully cultivated control he usually maintained was cracking under the strain. He stood, pacing the length of his mahogany desk, the polished surface reflecting his grim face. The weight of his past, the years spent believing himself barren, pressed down on him with renewed force. This revelation, this sudden, unexpected fatherhood, had brought joy, yes, but also a tidal wave of fear and guilt. "We need to protect Elijah," Eleanor said, her voice firm despite the tremor still present. She met Richard's gaze, her eyes reflecting a shared determination, a quiet strength that surprised even her. Their eyes held a silent conversation, a mutual understanding that transcended words. "Of course," Richard replied, his voice softer now, the anger receding, replaced by a weary resignation. He stopped pacing, his silhouette framed by the large bay window, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. He reached out, his hand finding hers, a silent promise of support, of shared responsibility. "We control the narrative. We protect him. Together." The shared gaze between them, however, held an unspoken fear, a worry that even their carefully constructed defenses might crumble under the immense pressure of the coming storm. The quiet strength in their joined hands, however, spoke volumes. Their love for Elijah, their newfound family, would be their shield. The weight of the impending press conference settled heavily on Eleanor. The opulent living room, usually a sanctuary of calm, felt suffocating. Sunlight glinted off the polished marble floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, a microscopic ballet mirroring the chaotic swirl of emotions within her. Richard, usually the picture of controlled composure, paced restlessly, his expensive Italian loafers barely whispering against the Persian rug. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that did little to mask the underlying tension. Elijah, curled up on a plush armchair, fiddled with a small, worn wooden toy car. His usually bright eyes were clouded with a quiet sadness that pierced Eleanor's heart. He was oblivious to the adults' strained whispers, yet his subtle body language spoke volumes. "This is insane," Richard finally exploded, his voice cracking. The carefully constructed facade of composure crumbled, revealing the raw anxiety beneath. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disheveling it in a gesture of frustration. "To think, after all these years, this is how it happens." Eleanor sat beside him, her hand reaching for his. His skin was cold, clammy. The warmth of her touch seemed to offer him some small comfort. "We have to be strong for Elijah," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. The words were as much a reassurance to herself as to Richard. He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at their son. The boy's quiet acceptance of the situation, his almost stoic resilience, was a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil swirling around him. Richard's guilt intensified. He had spent years believing himself incapable of fatherhood, only to discover his son, a child he had unknowingly fathered, existing in silence before him. He deserves some normalcy," Richard said, his voice thick with unshed tears. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, built brick by brick over years of denial and self-imposed isolation, were beginning to crumble. The years of emotional repression, the self-imposed exile from the joy of fatherhood, weighed heavily upon him. The revelation wasn't just about the biological connection. It was about the profound loss he had inflicted upon himself and, unknowingly, upon his son. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her own eyes brimming. "We'll give him that," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We'll protect him. Together." The shared gaze between them, this silent promise, was a beacon in the gathering storm, a testament to their love, their strength, and their unwavering commitment to their family, however unconventional its origins. The fight had only just begun, but in that shared look, they found the strength to face it together. The press conference loomed, a monstrous shadow stretching across their lives. Elijah, sensing the tension, retreated to his room, the quiet click of his toy car a small, heartbreaking counterpoint to the adult's strained silences. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of his room, illuminating dust motes dancing in golden shafts, a miniature reflection of the turmoil within him. He didn't understand the whispers, the hurried phone calls, the worried glances exchanged between his parents. He only knew a deep, unsettling unease had settled in his small heart. Later, Eleanor found him curled on his bed, clutching the worn wooden car. She sat beside him, the plush rug soft beneath her. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He looked up, his eyes wide and questioning. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable. Eleanor hesitated. How could she explain the impossible, the whirlwind of revelations that had turned their lives upside down? "Remember how we talked about families being different?" she began softly, her hand gently stroking his hair. "Well, sometimes the way families are made is even more surprising than we ever imagined." Richard entered then, his face etched with weariness, his usual controlled demeanor fractured. He knelt beside Elijah, his gaze filled with a poignant mixture of love and regret. "There's something we need to tell you, son," he began, his voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his hand hesitantly covering Elijah's. "It's about your DNA. The test results showed something unexpected." Elijah's brow furrowed. The word DNA held no particular meaning for him, but the solemnity in their voices spoke volumes. He looked from Eleanor to Richard, his eyes searching for answers. The weight of their combined grief and bewilderment settled upon him, a heavy cloak of unspoken anxieties. The silence stretched, punctuated only by Elijah's shallow breaths. The scent of lilies, a constant reminder of their luxurious but emotionally barren life before him, now seemed poignant and bittersweet, carrying the weight of unspoken feelings and long unacknowledged secrets. The opulent room, a symbol of their previous life, felt oppressive. The opulent setting suddenly felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the delicate fragility of their newly discovered truth. Their carefully constructed world was cracking, exposing the raw, vulnerable heart beneath. The air crackled with unspoken anxieties, the silence heavier than any words could express. In that moment, amidst the uncertainty and fear, a new chapter in their family's journey began, a journey towards understanding and acceptance, a journey filled with both heartache and hope. The press conference hung over them like a storm cloud. Elijah, sensing the oppressive atmosphere, retreated to his room, the rhythmic whir of his toy helicopter a fragile counterpoint to the adult's hushed anxieties. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in golden shafts, a miniature reflection of the chaos within. He didn't understand the hushed conversations, the hurried phone calls, the worried glances exchanged between his parents. He only felt a cold knot of unease tightening in his chest. Later, Eleanor found him curled on his bed, clutching the helicopter. The soft, plush rug did little to cushion the hardness in his small heart. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, kneeling beside him. He looked up, his eyes wide and questioning, mirroring her own apprehension. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. Eleanor hesitated. How could she explain the impossible, the seismic shift that had shattered their carefully constructed world? "Remember how we talked about families being different?" she began, her hand gently stroking his hair. Sometimes the way families are made is even more surprising than we imagined." Richard entered, his face etched with weariness, his usual controlled demeanor shattered. The weight of the situation was etched onto his usually stoic features. He knelt beside Elijah, his gaze a complex mixture of love and regret. "There's something we need to tell you, son," he began, his voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his hand hesitantly covering Elijah's. It's about your DNA. The tests, they showed something unexpected. Elijah's brow furrowed. The word DNA held no meaning for him, but the solemnity in their voices spoke volumes. He looked from Eleanor to Richard, his eyes searching for answers they couldn't yet provide. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken anxieties, the opulent room suddenly feeling oppressive, a stark contrast to the vulnerability in their eyes. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting aroma, now felt heavy, laden with the weight of their unspoken fears. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect life had crumbled, revealing the raw, exposed heart beneath. The air crackled with unspoken anxieties, the silence heavier than any words could express. In that moment, amidst the uncertainty and fear, a new chapter began. A journey fraught with heartache, yes, but also filled with the fragile promise of understanding and acceptance. A journey that would bind them together in ways neither could have ever predicted. The journey toward a truth more profound and more complex than any of them could have ever imagined. The lawyer's words hung in the air, sharp and precise, like shards of glass. The media, they're relentless. We need a strategy, a controlled narrative. Richard ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying the fatigue etched deep into his face. Eleanor, her usually vibrant eyes clouded with worry, squeezed his hand. The mahogany table in their lawyer's opulent office felt cold and unyielding beneath her touch. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood did little to soothe the turmoil within her. "We can't hide it forever," Richard murmured, his voice barely a whisper. The weight of his secret, of his son's secret, pressed down on him. The revelation had cracked the carefully constructed facade of their perfect life, revealing a raw, vulnerable heart beneath. Elijah, oblivious to the adult anxieties swirling around him, sat on the plush carpet, absorbed in a complex Lego creation. The muted click-clack of the tiny plastic bricks provided a stark contrast to the tension simmering in the room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in golden shafts. Even the cheerful brightness felt tainted by the looming threat of exposure. "What if we tell him the truth?" Eleanor's voice, usually so composed, trembled slightly. "Let him decide how to handle it. He deserves that." Richard hesitated. The idea both terrified and liberated him. Telling Elijah was a leap of faith, a trust in his son's resilience, in their bond. But the potential backlash, the media frenzy, the potential intrusion into their lives weighed heavily. He looked at Elijah, his son so utterly unaware of the storm brewing around him. A surge of guilt washed over him, a tidal wave of remorse for the years of silence, the secrets kept hidden. "He's 8 years old," Richard finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "How much can he really understand?" Eleanor rose, her movements purposeful and resolute. "He deserves the truth, Richard, and we deserve to face this together as a family." She crossed the room, her gaze settling on Elijah's intent concentration. The unwavering strength in her eyes reaffirmed his commitment. It was time to face the music, to navigate this storm as a family. They would face this together. The decision, however fraught with peril, felt like a step towards healing, toward a future he could scarcely comprehend, but one that held the glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. The lawyer's words still echoed, a chilling counterpoint to the soft murmur of Elijah's Lego bricks. The afternoon sun, once a comforting presence, now felt intrusive, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the tense silence. Richard watched his son, a tiny architect absorbed in his world, a stark contrast to the adult anxieties swirling around them. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden, a reminder of the years of secrets, of the chasm that had separated them. "He's so unaware," Richard whispered, more to himself than to Eleanor. His voice, usually commanding, was thin and fragile. Eleanor, her hand still resting on his, squeezed gently. "He'll be scared, Richard. Angry, maybe, but he deserves to know." Her voice was firm, a quiet strength radiating from her. She rose and knelt beside Elijah, her touch gentle as she stroked his hair. The sunlight caught the gold highlights, illuminating the quiet intelligence in his eyes. Elijah looked up, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mommy, this tower needs more support." His voice, innocent and unaware, pierced the heavy air. The unspoken hung between them, the weight of their secret, the impending storm. Richard felt a tremor of fear, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect life had crumbled, revealing the raw, vulnerable heart beneath. He had always been a man of control, of carefully crafted plans. This felt chaotic, terrifying. "We'll tell him tonight," Eleanor said, her voice low and steady, a calming presence in the maelstrom of Richard's fear. "After dinner, we'll do it together." He nodded, the simple act a monumental effort. The scent of lilies from the vase on the table, usually a calming fragrance, now felt cloying, heavy with the weight of their decision. He looked at Elijah again, at the innocent concentration on his Lego creation, and a wave of love, so profound it almost overwhelmed him, washed over him. This small boy, this child who had unwittingly brought them together, deserved the truth. He deserved his father. And Richard, despite the fear gnawing at him, deserved the chance to finally be a father. The journey would be fraught with difficulties, with challenges he could scarcely imagine, but he would face them. He would face them together as a family. The evening stretched before them, a canvas yet to be painted with the colors of revelation, truth, and the fragile hope of healing. The muted hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the otherwise silent kitchen. Richard stared at the half-eaten apple on his plate, its smooth skin a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. The weight of his past, the years of carefully constructed lies, pressed down on him. He picked at the apple, the tart juice a bitter reminder of the sweetness he denied himself for so long. Eleanor entered, a steaming mug in her hands, the scent of chamomile tea a fragile counterpoint to the heavy air. She placed the mug before him, her touch light but firm. "It's not going to be easy, Richard," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. The gentle clinking of the spoon against the ceramic mug was almost too loud in the strained silence. He looked up at her, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that both comforted and unsettled him. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I never imagined this." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the nervousness he tried to conceal. The afternoon sun, filtering through the kitchen window, cast long shadows across the polished floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. The familiar scene, once a source of comfort, now felt alien, charged with unspoken anxieties. Eleanor sat down opposite him, her gaze steady and understanding. "We'll face this together," she murmured, her voice a gentle balm to his raw nerves. For Elijah, the mention of his son brought a fresh wave of guilt, a bitter taste lingering on his tongue. He thought of Elijah's innocent face, the trust in his eyes, and the weight of his deception pressed down on him with renewed force. The silence stretched between them, a tangible thing, filled with unspoken fears and tentative hopes. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers, a silent promise of support. The warmth of her touch, a comforting presence in the storm brewing within him, offered a flicker of hope. He needed this, he realized her strength, her unwavering love. They had weathered storms before, but this was different, more profound. This was about facing his past, confronting the ghosts that had haunted him for years, and embracing a future he had never dared to dream of. He took a sip of the chamomile tea, the delicate floral notes a small comfort in the vast expanse of his apprehension. The evening stretched before them, a daunting yet necessary journey into the unknown. The crisp autumn air nipped at Richard's cheeks as he walked the manicured grounds of their estate. The vibrant reds and golds of the foliage offered no solace. The beauty felt jarring against the turmoil within him. He'd spent the afternoon poring over dusty boxes in the attic, unearthing faded photographs and yellowed letters, fragments of a past he'd buried deep. Each relic unearthed was a fresh wound, a painful reminder of his youthful recklessness, his callous disregard for the consequences of his actions. He stopped by the ancient oak, its gnarled branches reaching towards the heavens like supplicating arms. The rustling leaves whispered secrets only the wind could understand. He closed his eyes, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his nostrils. He inhaled deeply, trying to ground himself, to find some measure of peace in the face of overwhelming guilt. His phone buzzed, the sharp ring cutting through the quiet. It was Eleanor. "Richard, are you all right? Dinner's almost ready." Her voice, though calm, held a tremor of concern. "Yes, love," he replied, his voice rough. "Just taking a walk. I'll be in soon." He hung up, the weight of his silence heavy on his shoulders. The truth, he knew, hung between them like a shroud. He couldn't keep it hidden forever. The revelation of his biological link to Elijah had cracked the foundation of his carefully constructed world, forcing him to confront the man he had become and the man he could still be. Back inside, the warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, a stark contrast to the chill that still clung to him. The aroma of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air, a comforting domesticity that felt both fragile and precious. Eleanor was setting the table, her movements graceful, her expression serene, yet her eyes held a watchful intensity. He sat down, the polished mahogany table cool beneath his hands. He picked at his food, unable to swallow the lump in his throat. "It's a lot to process," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I know, but we'll do it together. We always have." Her hand reached across the table, covering his. Her touch, warm and reassuring, was a lifeline in the stormy sea of his remorse. The unspoken words hung between them, charged with the gravity of their situation. But in the shared silence, in the simple act of her hand resting in his, a quiet strength emerged. A strength born not of denial, but of shared responsibility and unwavering love. The future remained uncertain, shrouded in the shadows of the past, but tonight, at least, they faced it together. The library, usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, felt suffocating. Richard ran a hand through his thinning hair, the scent of old paper and leather doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. He'd spent hours sifting through genealogical records, the crisp pages a stark contrast to the tremor in his hands. Each confirmed detail, a birth date, a location, a name felt like a hammer blow to his already fragile composure. He found a faded photograph, a young woman with eyes that mirrored Elijah's, a startling resemblance that sent a jolt of recognition through him. Eleanor entered, her face etched with worry. "Anything?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper above the ticking of the grandfather clock. Richard looked up, his eyes brimming with a mixture of grief and a dawning understanding. I think I found her," he choked out, showing her the photograph. Eleanor's breath hitched. The image of the young woman, radiating a quiet beauty, held a haunting familiarity. She looks so much like Elijah," she whispered, her voice laced with a mix of awe and sorrow. The silence that followed hung heavy, thick with unspoken emotions. The weight of the past pressed down on them, a shared burden they would have to navigate together. "I need to tell Elijah," Richard said, his voice firm despite the trembling in his hands. The decision, once a daunting mountain, now felt inevitable. The truth, however painful, demanded to be revealed. The weight of his silence, the fear of facing the consequences, had become unbearable. Eleanor nodded, her hand finding his across the worn mahogany desk. "Yes," she agreed, her voice firm. "Together. We'll face this together, just like we always have." Her unwavering support offered a small measure of comfort, a beacon in the encroaching storm of their uncertain future. The aroma of brewing coffee, usually comforting, felt strangely sharp, mirroring the intensity of the moment. The quiet strength between them, a testament to their enduring love, offered a fragile hope amidst the impending revelation. The journey ahead remained arduous, but at least they would face it, hand in hand. The old oak desk in Richard's study felt cold beneath his trembling hands. The scent of pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now clung to the air like a shroud. He stared at the faded photograph, the young woman's eyes, so like Elijah's, mirroring his own confusion and a profound, unexpected grief. He hadn't anticipated this depth of emotion, this raw ache in his chest. The revelation wasn't just about a genetic marker. It was about a life unseen, a past he'd buried deep. He heard Eleanor's soft footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn to know the worry etched on her face. He knew the weight of this shared secret pressed heavily on her, too. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, her voice catching slightly. She touched his arm, a gentle gesture that spoke volumes. The touch, warm and reassuring, was a lifeline in the storm raging within him. Richard nodded, his throat thick with unshed tears. "She looks just like him, like Elijah." The words were heavy, laden with a lifetime of unspoken regrets. He looked at the photograph again, seeing not just a face, but a life, a story waiting to be told. A story that involved him whether he wanted it or not. The past, once a carefully constructed wall, was crumbling before his eyes. He'd lived a life of quiet success, built on the foundation of a carefully maintained lie. Now, that lie was shattering, revealing a truth both painful and profoundly beautiful. The fear of confronting this truth was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by something else, a burgeoning hope, a deep yearning for connection. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand covering his. "We'll tell Elijah together," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. The quiet strength in her voice, her unwavering support, was a balm to his wounded soul. He leaned his head against hers, the weight of his secrets momentarily lifting. The fear remained, but now it was intertwined with a fierce determination, a shared purpose that bound them together. This wasn't just about confronting the past. It was about building a future where truth and love could finally intertwine. The journey ahead would be challenging, but they would face it, hand in hand, as they always had. The quiet strength in their bond was a testament to their enduring love, a beacon in the gathering storm. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. Eleanor hummed a soft melody, the rhythmic clatter of cutlery a counterpoint to her quiet contentment. Richard, usually absorbed in the morning paper, watched her, a faint smile playing on his lips. The warmth in his gaze, a stark contrast to his former reserve, was a testament to the seismic shifts occurring within him. He'd spent the night poring over old photographs, piecing together fragments of a forgotten past, his own and Elijah's. "He looks so much like you, Richard," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile peace. She gestured towards a framed photo of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, the woman from the faded photograph he'd found in his study. Richard nodded, his throat tight. The grief, raw and visceral, still clawed at him, but it was tempered now with a nascent understanding. He'd spent his life building walls, shielding himself from the vulnerability that this revelation exposed. But the walls were crumbling, revealing not emptiness, but a surprising, achingly beautiful landscape. I never knew," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The confession wasn't just to Eleanor. It was to himself, a long-overdue acknowledgement of a life lived in the shadows. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand covering his. "We'll face this together," she said, her voice firm, conveying the unwavering support that had become his anchor. The silent promise in her eyes calmed the storm raging within him. He squeezed her hand, a silent expression of gratitude, of shared sorrow, and of a burgeoning hope that transcended their personal turmoil. The breakfast remained untouched, the mundane replaced by the weighty silence of shared revelation and the quiet strength of their unwavering love. The future, once shrouded in uncertainty, began to take shape, tinged with both sorrow and an unexpected joy. The journey would be arduous, but they would traverse it together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling lawn. Elijah, perched on the edge of the fountain, idly tossed pebbles into the water, the rhythmic splashes a counterpoint to the turmoil churning within him. The news, the revelation of his biological father, had settled like a heavy stone in his stomach. He'd spent the morning poring over old family photos, Richard's hesitant explanations weaving a tapestry of a past he never knew existed. He felt a strange mix of anger, confusion, and a deep, unsettling sadness. The carefully constructed world he knew was fractured, the pieces scattered like the pebbles now sinking beneath the shimmering surface. Richard watched him from the French doors, a familiar ache tightening in his chest. He'd expected anger, perhaps even rejection. But Elijah's quiet sadness was far more poignant, a reflection of his own buried grief. He longed to cross the distance separating them, to offer comfort, but the words eluded him. The weight of his past mistakes, the years of silence, felt like an insurmountable barrier. Eleanor, sensing the tension, joined Richard. "He needs time," she murmured, her hand resting gently on his arm. The warmth of her touch, a familiar comfort, eased the tightness in his chest. "He's processing everything." Later, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and rose, Elijah found Richard in his study, surrounded by old photographs and documents. The room, usually immaculate, was scattered with papers, a testament to the emotional upheaval. Elijah hesitated at the doorway, then stepped inside. "I found this," Elijah said quietly, holding out a faded photograph. It depicted a younger Richard, his face etched with a sadness that mirrored his own. He'd found it tucked into a dusty box. Richard took the photograph, his fingers tracing the lines of his younger self. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Before everything." Elijah looked at him, his gaze searching. "Was it hard?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard nodded, the tears welling in his eyes. He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "It was a life I tried to forget." He looked at Elijah, his gaze softening. "But now I want to understand it, for both of our sakes." He looked at Elijah, his son, the boy who had unknowingly brought him back to himself. The years of distance suddenly felt less insurmountable. The path ahead remained uncertain, shadowed by the weight of the past, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a flicker of hope, a warmth spreading through him, chasing away the lingering chill of his long-held regret. He wasn't just a father. He was a man facing his past and embracing his future, one uncertain step at a time. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of their opulent bedroom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Eleanor stirred, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the adjoining bathroom. Richard lay beside her, his face etched with the fatigue of a sleepless night. He hadn't slept well, the weight of his revelation pressing down on him like a physical burden. He watched Eleanor, the gentle rise and fall of her chest a silent testament to her peaceful slumber. A wave of guilt washed over him. He'd kept his turmoil hidden, fearing the impact on her. How could he explain the turmoil of rediscovering a son he'd never known? A son who was already deeply loved by the woman he loved. Eleanor awoke, her eyes meeting his. "Morning," she whispered, her voice soft and tender. He reached out, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "Morning," he replied, his voice hoarse. The unspoken questions hung heavy between them, a silent acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had altered their lives. He needed to talk to her, to share the burden of his newfound knowledge, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He saw the worry etched in her eyes. "Something's wrong, Richard," she murmured, her hand covering his. He took a deep breath, the air catching in his chest. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "About the tests, about Elijah." He hesitated, the enormity of the situation threatening to overwhelm him. The quiet luxury of their bedroom, usually a haven of peace, felt suffocating. The unspoken truth hung between them, thick and heavy, a shadow cast across their once perfect world. The love they shared was being tested, challenged by the unexpected revelation that had brought joy and sorrow in equal measure. The weight of his silence was crushing, and in the silence, their shared love felt more fragile than ever before. The following days were a blur of hushed conversations and stolen glances. The opulent emptiness of their home, once a symbol of their shared success, now felt like a stark reminder of their unspoken secret. Sunlight streamed through the vast windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent witness to their growing unease. Richard found himself avoiding Eleanor, the weight of his secret a physical burden. He'd spent his life controlling his emotions, burying them deep under layers of ambition and success. Now, this carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing a raw vulnerability he hadn't known he possessed. One evening, Eleanor found him in the study, staring out at the sprawling estate. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany desk, highlighting the weariness etched on his face. He looked older, somehow smaller, the weight of his secret visibly draining his energy. He turned, his eyes reflecting the turmoil within. "Richard," Eleanor said softly, her voice a gentle touch against the storm raging inside him. She moved towards him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The warmth of her touch seemed to pierce through his emotional armor. I can't keep this from you any longer," he began, his voice hoarse. He told her everything of the results of the tests, the implications, the fear that had paralyzed him. He spoke of the overwhelming joy, the crushing guilt, the fear of losing her. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of understanding, of shared wonder. "Oh, Richard," she whispered, pulling him into a hug. "It's extraordinary." The silence that followed was filled with the unspoken emotions. Relief, joy, a profound sense of wonder. This shared secret, this unexpected truth, had drawn them even closer. The opulent emptiness of their home suddenly felt less vast, less lonely. Their love, tested by this seismic revelation, had emerged stronger, more profound. The shared burden had, paradoxically, become their shared strength. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. The following weeks were a delicate dance of revelation and acceptance. Elijah, initially bewildered, clung to Eleanor, his small hand gripping hers with surprising strength. Richard, meanwhile, underwent a metamorphosis. The rigid lines around his mouth softened, replaced by a tentative smile that reached his eyes only occasionally. He spent hours in the sprawling garden, the scent of roses and damp earth a balm to his troubled soul. He'd always found solace in the meticulous order of his life, but now, the wild, untamed growth of the climbing roses seemed to mirror the burgeoning emotions within him. One afternoon, sitting on a weathered stone bench, Elijah tentatively broached the subject. "So, does this mean I have another mother?" His voice was barely a whisper, lost amidst the gentle rustling of leaves. Richard's throat tightened. He reached out, his touch hesitant at first, then firm as he covered Elijah's small hand with his own. "Yes, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There's another woman, your biological mother. We don't know much about her yet, but we're going to find out." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a distant fireplace. Elijah remained silent, absorbing the information. The weight of the revelation seemed immense for such a young boy, yet his eyes held a surprising depth of understanding. Will she want to meet me?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. Richard looked at him, his heart aching with empathy. "We hope so, Elijah, but whatever happens, you are our son. You always will be. Eleanor and I love you more than words can say." He pulled Elijah into a hug, burying his face in his son's soft hair. The scent of his son's shampoo mixed with the earthy scent of the garden and brought a fresh wave of emotion. He felt a warmth he'd never known before, a profound love that overshadowed the guilt and confusion. This wasn't just biological. It was a deep, abiding connection forged in shared experience and unspoken understanding. The opulent house behind them faded into insignificance. Here, in the quiet embrace of the garden, a new family was taking root, stronger and more resilient than either had ever imagined. The following weeks blurred into a montage of whispered conversations and stolen glances. Richard, usually a man of precise movements and clipped sentences, found himself fumbling with Elijah's shoelaces, his fingers clumsy with a newfound tenderness. The vast, echoing house felt smaller now, filled with a quiet intimacy that had been absent before. He found himself drawn to the kitchen, where Eleanor, her usual calm demeanor slightly frayed, hummed softly as she baked cookies, the sweet scent of vanilla and cinnamon filling the air. One evening, while the three sat around the fire in the living room, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, Elijah spoke, his voice small but clear. "Daddy," he said, using the word for the first time without hesitation. Did you know about me before?" Richard's breath hitched. He looked at Eleanor, seeking reassurance, then back at Elijah, his eyes mirroring the boy's vulnerability. The warmth of the fire seemed to amplify the emotions swirling in the room. "Yes, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I knew." He couldn't bring himself to say more. The confession hung heavy in the air, unspoken words a palpable presence between them. Eleanor reached out, her hand covering Richard's. The simple gesture spoke volumes of support, of unwavering love, of shared responsibility. "It was a long time ago," she added gently, "before you were even a twinkle in your father's eye. But the important thing is we're all together now." Elijah nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. The crackling fire, once a comforting sound, now seemed to echo the turmoil in his heart. He didn't understand the full weight of the revelation, but he sensed the profound change it represented, a shift in the familiar landscape of his life, a subtle but significant rewriting of his past. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was filled with the unspoken words of love and acceptance, a quiet testament to the bond that was forming, stronger and more complex than any of them could have anticipated. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the bittersweet aroma of vanilla, a poignant reminder of both the pain and the healing that lay ahead. The following weeks were a blur of hesitant smiles and searching glances. Richard, usually so precise, found himself clumsy with Elijah's shoelaces, his touch tentative, yet tender. The cavernous house, once a symbol of their isolation, felt smaller, more intimate, the silence punctuated by the soft clinking of china as Eleanor prepared dinner. The aroma of rosemary and garlic, usually unnoticed, now filled Richard with a strange, poignant comfort. He found himself drawn to the kitchen, watching Eleanor's usually calm hands knead dough, a slight tremor betraying the emotional strain. One evening, nestled on the plush sofa before a crackling fire, Elijah finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Daddy," he said, the word a tentative bridge across a chasm of unspoken emotions. Did you know about me before?" Richard's heart lurched. He glanced at Eleanor, her eyes mirroring his apprehension, before turning back to Elijah. The firelight danced across his face, casting shifting shadows that seemed to amplify the unspoken weight of the moment. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his guilt and burgeoning love. "Yes, son," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. I knew." The confession hung heavy in the air, a fragile thing, yet strong enough to break the dam of his years of silence. Eleanor reached across the sofa, her hand covering his. The simple gesture was a lifeline, a silent declaration of unwavering support. "It was a long time ago, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice calm yet laced with understanding. "But what matters is that we're together now." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The fire's crackle, once soothing, now echoed the turmoil within him. He didn't grasp the full significance of the revelation, but he sensed a profound shift, a rewriting of his past, a new chapter unfolding before him. The ensuing silence wasn't awkward. It was a quiet testament to their shared experience, a tapestry woven with threads of love, acceptance, and the bittersweet understanding of a family forged in unexpected circumstances. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the subtle sweetness of the vanilla cookies Eleanor had baked, a poignant reminder of both the pain they'd endured and the healing that was finally underway. The journey would be long, but they were beginning it together. The attic air hung thick with dust motes dancing in the lone shaft of sunlight. Elijah, surrounded by faded photographs and forgotten trinkets, traced a finger across a sepia-toned image of a young man with Richard's eyes, a hesitant smile playing on his lips. The resemblance was uncanny. He felt a prickle of something akin to recognition, a ghost of a feeling he couldn't quite grasp. "He looks sad," Elijah murmured, more to himself than to Richard, who stood silently by the open trunk. Richard swallowed, the lump in his throat a familiar companion these past few weeks. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. "He was young," he finally said, his voice low, "and burdened by things he didn't understand." Elijah picked up a tarnished silver locket, its surface cool against his fingertips. Inside, a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile stared back. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice hushed with a newfound reverence for the past. Richard hesitated, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't shield Elijah from the truth any longer. "Your grandmother," he whispered, the word foreign on his tongue. "My mother." The confession hung heavy in the air, a fragile bridge across a chasm of years. He saw a flicker of understanding, a dawning recognition in Elijah's eyes. The boy didn't speak, but the quiet intensity of his gaze spoke volumes. He was piecing together the fragments, connecting the dots, building a narrative that included him, that finally gave him a sense of belonging. The dust motes continued their silent dance, oblivious to the emotional earthquake unfolding in the hushed attic, a silent witness to the burgeoning bond between father and son. The scent of old paper and forgotten memories hung in the air, a bittersweet perfume of the past, mingling with the promise of a future finally coming into focus. The journey was far from over, but in that dusty attic, under the shaft of sunlight, healing had begun. The crisp autumn air bit at Elijah's cheeks as he and Richard drove towards the small, coastal town. The car, a sleek silver machine that usually hummed with silent power, felt heavy with unspoken words. Richard, usually so controlled, fidgeted with the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "She lives in a small cottage overlooking the sea," he finally said, his voice rough. It's been a long time." Elijah, surprisingly calm, gazed out the window. The landscape, a blur of russet and gold, mirrored the turmoil within him. He'd spent weeks piecing together his past, the fragmented images coalescing into a surprisingly clear picture. He understood now the sadness in his grandmother's eyes, the unspoken grief clinging to Richard's silences. The cottage was as Richard described, small, weathered, but undeniably charming. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the gray sky. A woman, her silver hair catching the light, stood on the porch, a figure both frail and strong. As they approached, a hesitant smile touched her lips. "Richard," she said, her voice soft, tinged with an accent Elijah hadn't heard before. Her eyes, the same shade of hazel as his own, held a mixture of apprehension and hope. "And you must be Elijah." Her gaze softened as she took in his features, the subtle resemblance to Richard undeniable. The meeting wasn't explosive, nor was it cold. It was a delicate dance of emotions, cautious steps across a bridge built from years of silence and unspoken pain. There were tears, yes, but also laughter, shared memories, tentative connections, and the slow, comforting realization that the past, however painful, didn't have to define the future. The sea, a constant presence, seemed to mirror their emotional journey, its waves crashing and receding, reflecting the ebb and flow of their feelings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a fragile peace settled over them. The air was thick with unspoken understanding, the beginnings of a new chapter unfolding under the watchful gaze of the vast, forgiving ocean. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and sea salt, a comforting aroma that did little to calm the tremor in Richard's hands. He squeezed Elijah's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Elijah, though outwardly calm, felt the weight of unspoken expectations. His grandmother, Sarah, offered them tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. The chipped porcelain cups warmed their hands, a small comfort in the vastness of their shared history. "It's good to see you, Richard," Sarah said, her voice raspy with age yet strong. Her gaze, however, lingered on Elijah, a mixture of curiosity and something akin to awe in its depths. Richard cleared his throat. We wanted Elijah to meet you." He glanced at his son, who met his gaze with a quiet understanding. The silence stretched, heavy with the years of separation, the unspoken regrets. Elijah, breaking the tense silence, spoke softly. "I found some old photos," he said, holding out a worn photograph. It showed a younger Richard, his face etched with a sadness Elijah now understood. I think you were happy then." Sarah's eyes welled. She took the photo, her fingers tracing the lines of Richard's younger face. "Yes," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her weathered cheek. "We were before." The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the past. The sea outside crashed against the rocks, a constant reminder of the relentless power of time and circumstance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a fragile truce between grief and acceptance. The tea grew cold, forgotten in the quiet intensity of the moment. Yet, in that shared silence, in the gentle touch of Sarah's hand on Elijah's, a fragile bond began to form, a connection forged in the crucible of sorrow and understanding. It was a beginning, not an ending, a delicate seedling pushing through the hardened earth of the past, reaching towards a future bathed in the warm light of acceptance. The following weeks were a blur of quiet adjustments. Richard, surprisingly, found solace in the garden, his hands coaxing life from the soil, mirroring the tender care he now lavished on Elijah. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine calmed his frayed nerves. He'd spend hours there, the rhythmic movement of his spade a meditation, a silent conversation with the burgeoning life around him. One evening, under the soft glow of the setting sun, Eleanor found him kneeling beside a newly planted rose bush, its delicate buds unfurling. He looked up, his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now soft with a gentle weariness. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice husky. Eleanor sat beside him, the rough texture of the stone bench a grounding presence. "You're becoming quite the gardener," she said softly, her voice laced with affection. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "I'm learning to nurture things," he confessed, his gaze falling back to the rose. "Things I almost lost." Their silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the city. The unspoken words hung in the air, a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of their journey. The weight of their shared secret still pressed upon them, but it felt lighter now, diffused by the quiet acceptance that had settled between them. The garden, once a symbol of their carefully cultivated, emotionally barren life, was now a testament to their burgeoning emotional growth. It bloomed alongside them, mirroring their shared healing. The roses, Richard hoped, would outlive them all, a legacy of love and a silent witness to their transformed lives. Their relationship was no longer defined by the absence of a child, but by the deep love they had found in the unexpected embrace of fate and the blossoming of their family. The crisp autumn air nipped at Elijah's cheeks as he sat on the porch swing, the rhythmic creak a counterpoint to the rustling leaves. He clutched a worn photo album, its pages filled with pictures of unfamiliar faces. A younger Richard, his face etched with a worry Elijah now understood. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, labeled simply Mother. He'd spent weeks poring over these images, trying to piece together a past that felt both distant and intimately his. The scent of wood smoke from the nearby fireplace mingled with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves, a comforting blend that did little to ease the churning in his stomach. He flipped a page, stopping at a picture of a young girl with bright eyes and a mischievous grin. "Who is she?" He'd asked Richard a few days ago, his voice barely a whisper. Richard had hesitated, then said, "That's your aunt, your mother's sister." The explanation felt incomplete, leaving a void that only fueled Elijah's desire to know more. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. Eleanor knelt beside him, her touch soft, reassuring. "Thinking about your mother again, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the girl in the photograph. "I wish I could meet her," he murmured, his voice tight with unshed tears. "To know why she gave me away." Eleanor pulled him into a hug, the warmth of her embrace a balm to his troubled soul. "I know it's hard, honey," she whispered, "but remember, you are loved. We love you, Richard loves you. And even if you never meet your biological mother, that doesn't change a thing." He pulled away slightly, looking up at her with questioning eyes. "But she's my mother, isn't she? Does that mean I'm not really your son?" Eleanor's heart ached at his words, but she held his gaze, her own filled with unwavering love. "You're our son, Elijah. Our family. Blood doesn't define family. Love does." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "Richard and I were meant to find you, Elijah. It was fate. And you are every bit as much our son as if you had been born to us." The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. The air grew colder, but a warmth bloomed in Elijah's heart, a fragile bud of acceptance pushing through the soil of uncertainty. He wasn't sure about the future, about meeting his biological mother, but he knew with a certainty that surprised him that he was loved. He was home, and that was enough for now. The following weeks unfolded in a gentle rhythm of normalcy. The initial storm had passed, leaving behind a calmer sea, though the undercurrents of their newly revealed family history still ran deep. The crisp winter air, scented with pine and wood smoke, permeated their sprawling home, a stark contrast to the sterile feeling it once held. Richard, noticeably softer, spent hours playing chess with Elijah, his brow furrowed in concentration, a genuine smile playing on his lips. He'd even started baking clumsy attempts at gingerbread men that were more misshapen than perfect, yet undeniably heartfelt. One evening, nestled by the fire, Eleanor watched them. Elijah, usually reserved, was animated, laughing freely at one of Richard's bad jokes. The sight filled her with a bittersweet ache. A pang of the old loneliness tugged at her, a ghost of the yearning she'd once felt. But it was quickly eclipsed by a deeper emotion, a quiet joy at witnessing this newfound connection. "He's really opening up," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely a whisper, as Richard gently ruffled Elijah's hair. Richard looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. A warmth spread through Eleanor's chest, a familiar comfort in the silent understanding that passed between them. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Elijah. He's my son," he said, the words thick with emotion. "And I didn't even know it." Elijah, sensing the shared moment, looked up from the chessboard. "I'm glad you're my dad," he said, his voice small but firm. The simplicity of his statement held an immense weight. It was a declaration, an acceptance, a bridge built across a chasm of uncertainty. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was a comfortable quietude, filled with the crackling fire and the unspoken understanding between them. It was the quiet affirmation of a family, forged not in blood alone, but in love, resilience, and the extraordinary twists of fate. The scent of gingerbread hung sweet in the air, a tangible symbol of their newfound happiness, a testament to the extraordinary journey they'd shared, and the even brighter future that awaited them. The following spring brought a thaw not just to the landscape, but to the hearts within their home. Sunlight streamed through the newly leafed branches, painting dappled patterns on the polished floors. Elijah, taller now, more confident, practiced his saxophone in the sunroom, the melody a joyful counterpoint to the birdsong outside. The sound, once a source of mild irritation to Richard, now filled him with a quiet pride. One evening, after a family dinner punctuated by laughter and easy conversation, a stark contrast to the strained silences of the past, Richard found Elijah sketching in his room. The boy was meticulously detailing a bird, capturing its delicate feathers with remarkable precision. "That's beautiful, son," Richard said, his voice gentler than he'd ever dared let it be before. Elijah looked up, a shy smile gracing his lips. "It's a robin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one that sings outside my window every morning." Richard knelt beside him, the scent of charcoal and paper filling his nostrils. He felt a pang of bittersweet longing. He thought of the years he'd missed, the countless mornings he'd slept through the robin's song, oblivious to the life unfolding just beyond his bedroom window. "You know," Richard began, his voice catching slightly, "your mother, your biological mother, I've been thinking about contacting her." Elijah's hand stilled, the charcoal pencil poised mid-stroke. He didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the robin's delicate wing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, laden with unspoken anxieties. Richard braced himself for a rejection, a surge of anger, a wall of defiance. Instead, Elijah's small voice broke the stillness. "Maybe," he whispered, his eyes still downcast, "maybe it's time." The simplicity of his words, the quiet acceptance, sent a wave of profound emotion crashing over Richard. Tears welled in his eyes, a mixture of relief and overwhelming love. He pulled his son into a hug, holding him close, the scent of his hair familiar and comforting. This wasn't just about resolving the past. It was about embracing a future richer and more complex than he could have ever imagined. The robin outside continued its song, a gentle melody of acceptance and hope, resonating through the quiet room, a testament to the resilience of love and the unexpected beauty of family. The warmth of the spring sun illuminated not only the boy's drawing, but the profound transformation of a father's heart. The following weeks unfolded in a gentle rhythm of readjustment. The opulent house, once a symbol of their emptiness, now echoed with laughter, Elijah's boisterous guffaws mingling with Eleanor's soft chuckles. Richard, surprisingly, found himself drawn to the kitchen, the scent of Eleanor's baking bread a comforting counterpoint to the anxieties that still lingered. He'd spend evenings helping Elijah with his homework, the boy's quiet concentration, a stark contrast to Richard's former-driven ambition. One evening, while watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Richard tentatively reached out and touched Elijah's hair. The boy didn't flinch. "It's strange," Elijah murmured, his gaze fixed on the vibrant sky. "Having a dad who actually cares." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Richard swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his guilt. He didn't know how to respond, how to bridge the chasm created by years of absence. He simply squeezed Elijah's shoulder, the gesture clumsy yet heartfelt. I'm learning," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Learning to be a better father." Eleanor, witnessing the tender moment from the doorway, felt a pang of bittersweet emotion. Their family was different, irrevocably changed. Yet, this new, unconventional family was stronger, more vibrant, than she could have ever imagined. The warmth radiating from the father and son filled her with a quiet joy, a sense of belonging that transcended the initial shock of revelation. The opulent house, once a cold, empty shell, now pulsed with a life force that surprised even Eleanor herself. The quiet understanding between Richard and Elijah, born from a shared past and a blossoming present, promised a future filled with love and healing. The robin outside continued its song, a constant melody of hope in the ever-changing landscape of their lives. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and fallen leaves, seeped through the open windows of their sprawling kitchen. Sunlight, filtered through the ancient oak trees, dappled the polished mahogany table where they sat. Elijah, his dark eyes bright with curiosity, traced patterns on his plate with a fingertip. Eleanor, her hand resting gently on Richard's, watched them both, a silent observer in their evolving dynamic. "So," Elijah began, his voice hesitant, "about my other mom." Richard's breath hitched. The question, so simply posed, felt like a physical blow. He'd spent weeks preparing for this, yet the weight of his past, of his silence, still pressed heavily on his chest. He looked at Eleanor, seeking strength in her unwavering gaze. "We've started looking into it," Richard said, his voice low, choosing his words carefully. "There's a lot we don't know yet, but we're doing everything we can to find out more." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the intricate grain of the wooden table. I guess I'm just curious," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "About who she is, what she's like." The silence stretched, filled only with the gentle clinking of cutlery and the soft rustle of leaves outside. Richard reached across the table, his fingers brushing Elijah's. The contact, fleeting yet profound, spoke volumes of unspoken emotions. He squeezed gently, a gesture of solidarity, of shared vulnerability. "We'll find out together," Richard promised, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll face whatever comes next as a family." He glanced at Eleanor, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, their newfound strength. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, highlighting the poignant intimacy of their moment. The weight of the past remained, but it no longer felt so crushing. They were forging a new path, a path paved with love, honesty, and a fragile hope for the future. The warmth of the setting sun seemed to mirror the burgeoning warmth in their hearts. The following weeks were a blur of quiet moments and significant shifts. Richard, once a man of clipped words and controlled emotions, found himself unexpectedly articulate, his voice softening as he spoke to Elijah. The sterile formality that had once permeated their home had been replaced by a tentative warmth. Evenings were spent not in silent contemplation, but in shared laughter over board games, the scent of popcorn mingling with the wood smoke from the fireplace. One evening, after a particularly heartfelt conversation about Elijah's potential search for his birth mother, Richard found Eleanor in the garden, tending her roses. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the vibrant blooms in hues of gold and crimson. He sat beside her, the scent of damp earth and roses filling his senses. "She's a strong woman," Eleanor murmured, her gaze fixed on a particularly perfect bloom. "To have given him up, it must have taken immense courage." Richard nodded, his throat tightening. "I'm starting to understand that," he admitted, his voice husky. "The courage it takes to love someone so deeply, even when you can't keep them." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "It's not just about courage, Richard. It's about love. And sometimes love means letting go." He reached for her hand, his touch tentative yet reassuring, the rough texture of her calloused fingers against his felt grounding. "I'm grateful for her," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Grateful for the gift she gave us." A silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle hum of bees amongst the roses. It was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding and shared grief, but also with a burgeoning hope for the future. The weight of the past still lingered, a phantom limb, but it was fading, overshadowed by the warmth of their present and the promise of their future. The journey had been arduous, but they were finally beginning to find peace, together, as a family. The following weeks unfolded like a slow, deliberate sunrise. Richard, once a man shrouded in controlled silence, now found his voice, a hesitant baritone that nonetheless resonated with genuine warmth. He helped Elijah with his homework, the scent of old books and freshly sharpened pencils mingling with the aroma of brewing coffee. He even attempted, somewhat clumsily, to braid Elijah's hair, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar task, eliciting a shy smile from the boy. One crisp autumn afternoon, they were raking leaves in the expansive garden, the crunch of dried leaves underfoot a comforting sound. Elijah, his cheeks flushed with exertion, tossed a handful of leaves into the air, watching them swirl before settling back to earth. Do you think she'll want to meet me?" Elijah asked, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on the swirling leaves. Richard paused, the rake momentarily still. The sun, low in the sky, cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. He knelt beside his son, the cool earth a comforting weight against his knees. "I don't know, son," he said, his voice soft. "But whatever she decides, it doesn't change how much we love you." Elijah looked up, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity that surprised Richard. "I love you too, Dad," he said, the words simple yet profound, carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. The simple act of raking leaves, once a mundane chore, transformed into a moment of profound connection. That evening, Eleanor found Richard staring out the vast living room window, his profile illuminated by the setting sun. The opulent room, once a symbol of their barren emotional landscape, now felt filled with a warmth that transcended its gilded surfaces. He looked older, somehow wiser. The lines etched on his face spoke not just of age, but of a journey undertaken, a burden shed. "He's a good boy," Richard murmured, his gaze distant, but his tone filled with an unfamiliar gentleness. "He deserves to know." Eleanor walked to his side, placing a comforting hand on his arm. The touch was electric, a silent communication between two souls who had weathered a storm together. "We'll face whatever comes next, together," she whispered, her voice resonating with unwavering support. The grand room, filled with the quiet murmur of the fireplace, was no longer a monument to their loss, but a testament to their newfound strength. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they faced it not alone, but hand in hand, a family forged in the crucible of unexpected truth. The following months were a balm. The initial storm of revelation had subsided, leaving behind a calmer, if still unpredictable, sea. Richard, astonishingly, blossomed. The rigid lines around his mouth softened, replaced by a tentative smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He learned to laugh freely, the sound echoing through the once silent hallways of their home, a sound that resonated with genuine joy. He spent hours with Elijah, building model airplanes, their fingers clumsy but coordinated, a quiet symphony of shared focus. The scent of wood glue and paint replaced the sterile aroma of expensive cleaning solutions that once permeated their lives. One evening, nestled on the plush rug in front of a crackling fire, Elijah confessed a fear that had been quietly simmering. What if she doesn't want me?" His voice was barely audible above the fire's crackle. His eyes, usually bright and mischievous, were clouded with uncertainty. Richard sat beside him, the warmth of the fire reflecting in his eyes, a warmth Elijah had only recently become familiar with. He gently placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, the touch surprisingly gentle, almost hesitant. "Son," he said, his voice low and steady, "your mother, whoever she is, made a choice. She gave you life, that's a powerful thing. But you belong here with us. We chose you, and we love you, unconditionally." Eleanor, observing them from the doorway, felt a familiar pang of something that wasn't quite jealousy, but a poignant awareness of her own place in their evolving family dynamic. She had always loved Elijah, but now, witnessing this bond bloom between father and son, she felt a new tenderness, a deeper understanding of the complicated tapestry of their family. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Richard watched Elijah leave for school, a small, almost imperceptible wave of sadness washing over him. He knew the search for Elijah's birth mother was inevitable, and with it came the possibility of losing him, a fear that burrowed deep beneath his newfound happiness. He turned, catching Eleanor's gaze. Her smile was soft, reassuring. "It's okay to be scared," she whispered, walking towards him, her hand finding his. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise of unwavering support, of shared love, of a future built not on wealth or societal expectations, but on the unbreakable bonds of family. This family, forged in the crucible of a surprising truth, felt more real, more precious than anything either of them had ever known. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling lawn. Richard, perched on the patio, nursed a glass of iced tea, the clinking of ice a counterpoint to the rhythmic chirping of crickets. He watched Elijah, lost in a game of catch with a golden retriever, a picture of carefree joy. The transformation in his son was remarkable. The quiet sadness that had initially clung to him like a shadow had largely dissipated, replaced by a vibrant energy. A wave of guilt washed over Richard. He'd spent so many years walled off by his own pain, his fear of intimacy. Now, seeing Elijah's uninhibited happiness, he felt a profound pang of regret for the years lost. He'd been a father in name only, a provider of material comfort, not genuine connection. Eleanor joined him, settling into the wicker chair beside him. The scent of her lavender perfume mingled with the fresh-cut grass. "He's happy," she murmured, her voice soft, a gentle observation rather than a question. Richard nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Incredibly happy." He paused, then added, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "And I'm learning to be a better father." Eleanor reached out, her hand covering his. Her touch was a silent acknowledgement, a reassurance. "We both are," she said, her eyes filled with a love that was both deep and unwavering. The unspoken words hung between them, the shared journey, the anxieties still lingering, the incredible bond forged in the unexpected crucible of their lives. The afternoon sun warmed them, a comforting blanket against the uncertainties of the future, a silent promise of a love that had grown stronger, deeper, in the face of adversity. The future was unwritten, but for the first time, Richard felt ready to face whatever came, hand in hand with Eleanor, their love a shield against the storms, their family a sanctuary. The following autumn, Elijah excelled at his school science fair, his project on bioluminescence earning him first place. The scent of freshly baked cookies filled the expansive kitchen as Eleanor helped him arrange his award-winning diorama. Richard, usually engrossed in spreadsheets, hovered nearby, a silent observer, his eyes filled with a quiet pride that surprised even himself. The polished mahogany table, usually a symbol of his controlled life, was now cluttered with glitter, wires, and miniature jellyfish. "It's amazing, son," Richard said, his voice softer than usual, a tremor betraying the emotion welling inside him. He carefully picked up a tiny, glowing plastic creature. The contrast between the rough texture of the model and the smoothness of his meticulously manicured hands was striking. Elijah grinned, his eyes shining with a confidence Richard hadn't seen before. "Thanks, Dad. It was a lot of work, but it was fun." Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with joy. The transformation in Richard had been gradual but undeniable. The icy barriers around his heart had melted, revealing a warmth that had been long dormant. The clinking of silverware from the nearby dining room served as a gentle reminder that even amidst this joyful chaos, their family life still thrived with ritual and routine. He was no longer just a provider, but a present, participating parent. Later that evening, curled up on the plush sofa in front of a crackling fireplace, Elijah confessed, "Sometimes I still wonder about my mom, but it's okay. I have you both." The flickering firelight danced across his face, illuminating the maturity that had settled in his young eyes. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint aroma of Eleanor's lavender body lotion, filling the room with an atmosphere of warmth and acceptance. Richard cleared his throat, the familiar tightness returning briefly. "We're glad you're with us, son." He reached out, his hand settling gently on Elijah's shoulder. It wasn't a possessive gesture, but one of profound tenderness, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. The unspoken words, the regret, the relief, the overwhelming love hung heavy in the air, a testament to the resilience of their unconventional family. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls, a silent witness to the healing that had taken place. The future still held uncertainties, but tonight, nestled in the heart of their comfortable, transformed home, they felt secure, bound together by a love that had endured. The following spring, Elijah turned 9. The sprawling gardens of their estate, once a symbol of Richard's detached wealth, now echoed with the joyous sounds of children's laughter. A small, brightly colored playhouse stood near the rose bushes, a testament to the family's evolving dynamic. Inside, Elijah meticulously arranged miniature plastic dinosaurs, a stark contrast to the sterile order Richard once prized. Sunlight streamed through the expansive windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor sat nearby, sketching in a large, leather-bound journal, the faint scent of charcoal and old paper filling the air. She watched Elijah, a soft smile playing on her lips. The initial pang of displacement she'd felt after the revelation had faded, replaced by a profound love for this boy, her son, their son. Richard entered, carrying a tray laden with steaming mugs. The clinking of china broke the quiet hum of activity. He placed the mugs on a small table beside Eleanor, his movements surprisingly gentle. "Cocoa?" he offered, his voice a low murmur, devoid of the usual crispness. Elijah looked up, his eyes reflecting the sunlight. "Thanks, Dad." The scene held a poignant quietude. The years of emotional distance that had separated father and son were slowly dissolving, replaced by a tentative but genuine bond. Richard watched them, his heart swelling with a love so profound it almost hurt. He'd spent years building walls around his emotions. Now he was painstakingly dismantling them, brick by painful brick. Eleanor touched his hand, a silent acknowledgement of his progress. "He's growing up so fast," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "He is," he agreed, a hint of wonder in his voice. The man who once measured success in millions now found fulfillment in the simple joy of watching his son play. The transformation was complete, albeit still fragile, like a newly planted sapling struggling to take root. The future was uncertain, but the present held a promise of growth, of a love that had been long dormant, but now bloomed vibrantly in the heart of their unconventional family. The following autumn, Elijah excelled in his school's science fair, his project on genetic inheritance earning him first place. The aroma of freshly baked cookies filled their expansive kitchen as Eleanor helped him carefully pack his prize-winning model of DNA. Richard, usually reserved, beamed with quiet pride, his gaze lingering on his son's focused brow. The crisp air of the approaching winter seeped in through the open window, carrying the scent of falling leaves. "I never understood genetics before," Elijah admitted, carefully taping a label to his project. His fingers, surprisingly steady for an 11-year-old, moved with precision. Richard cleared his throat. "It's complicated," he began, then hesitated. The words hung heavy in the air, the unspoken truth of their shared genetic connection, a palpable presence between them. Eleanor, sensing the unspoken tension, stepped in. "It's like a puzzle, honey," she said gently, kneeling beside him. "Sometimes, the pieces fit together in unexpected ways." She ruffled his hair. The warmth in her touch, a constant reassurance, helped bridge the gap between father and son. Later that evening, nestled in the plush comfort of the family room, surrounded by the soft glow of a crackling fireplace, Richard surprised them both. He pulled out a worn photograph, its edges softened with age. It depicted a younger, thinner Richard, his face etched with a weariness that belied his years. Beside him stood a woman, her smile radiant, her eyes sparkling with a light that resonated with the gentle joy in Elijah's eyes. "This is your mother," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The image was a silent testament to a past he'd long buried, a past that now connected him to the son he'd almost lost before he'd ever found him. The years of emotional distance began to crumble, replaced by a tentative but profound connection. Eleanor watched the scene unfold, her heart overflowing with a complex mix of emotions: relief, awe, and a profound sense of gratitude. Their journey had been arduous, filled with unexpected twists and turns, but the love that bound them together now shone brighter than ever before, casting its warm glow over their unconventional, yet deeply loving family. The silence that followed was filled with the unspoken promise of a future yet to be written, a future built not on wealth or circumstance, but on the unwavering strength of a love forged in the crucible of unexpected discovery. The following spring, Elijah turned 12. The sprawling garden, usually a backdrop to their opulent life, now felt smaller, more intimate. Laughter, once a rare sound, echoed frequently among the blossoming rose bushes. Richard, his usually stiff posture softened, knelt beside Elijah, showing him how to graft a rose cutting. The scent of damp earth and blooming roses hung heavy in the air. "It's like a miracle," Elijah murmured, his fingers surprisingly deft. He'd inherited a green thumb, Richard mused, just as he'd inherited his rare genetic marker. "A miracle," Richard agreed, his voice rough with unshed emotion. He wasn't just teaching Elijah about grafting. He was nurturing a bond forged in the crucible of a shared genetic secret, a secret that had reshaped their lives. Later, inside, the warmth of the sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eleanor watched them from the doorway, a quiet smile playing on her lips. The years of longing, the initial shock of the revelation, the anxieties and fears, they seemed distant now, softened by the present joy. "He's flourishing," Eleanor said, her voice soft, as she approached them. Richard nodded, his eyes meeting hers. A shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of their journey, passed between them. "He's found his roots," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. The unspoken understanding hung between them, rich and unspoken, the roots of their family, once barren, now deeply intertwined, blooming with unexpected beauty. The future was still uncertain, but the present, this shared moment of peace and love, was undeniably real. The fear and uncertainty had faded, replaced by a profound and enduring love that had transformed their lives. 5 years later, the sprawling estate hummed with a different energy. Laughter, once a precious commodity, now spilled freely from the sun-drenched rooms. Elijah, now a teenager, wrestled playfully with Richard on the manicured lawn, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the perfume of climbing roses. Eleanor watched from the veranda, a steaming mug of tea warming her hands, her heart overflowing with a quiet joy. The initial shock, the legal battles, the anxieties, all seemed like distant echoes in the symphony of their newfound happiness. "Dad, you're cheating," Elijah yelled, his laughter echoing across the perfectly groomed lawn. Richard, his face flushed with exertion and amusement, feigned defeat. All right, I surrender. Your superior athleticism has triumphed." He ruffled Elijah's hair, a gesture that once felt foreign now felt entirely natural. That evening, gathered around a crackling fireplace, the warmth radiating outwards, mirroring the warmth within their family unit, Eleanor spoke, her voice soft yet clear. "Remember that first Thanksgiving, Elijah? You were so quiet, so unsure." Elijah smiled, a nostalgic glint in his eyes. "I was scared. I didn't know if I fit in." Richard reached across the hearth, his hand covering Elijah's. "You fit in perfectly, son. You always have." His voice, once tight with suppressed emotion, was now rich and resonant with love. The unspoken acknowledgement of their shared journey hung in the air, thick and comforting. Eleanor squeezed Richard's hand, a silent testament to their enduring love, a love forged in the crucible of uncertainty and blossomed into an unshakable bond. The years had healed the wounds, leaving behind a family that was stronger, more resilient, and undeniably complete. The future stretched before them, unfurling like a map of endless possibilities, a testament to the power of forgiveness, acceptance, and the enduring strength of the human heart. Their story, once a tale of longing and unexpected revelations, was now a testament to the enduring power of family, a love that had transcended genetics, adoption, and the complexities of the past, to bloom into something truly extraordinary. The following summer, Elijah turned 15. The sprawling lawns of their estate hosted a barbecue, the air thick with the scent of grilling burgers and laughter. Sunlight dappled through the leaves of ancient oak trees, casting dancing shadows on the lively scene. Richard, his face softened by years of healing, watched Elijah effortlessly navigate the social whirl, engaging in easy conversation with Eleanor's friends and family. A subtle pride, a quiet joy, radiated from him. "He's really blossomed," Eleanor whispered, her hand resting lightly on Richard's arm. The casual touch held a depth of intimacy forged in shared trials. Richard nodded, his eyes lingering on Elijah's easy smile. "He's amazing, more than I ever could have imagined." He paused, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. I still feel like I robbed him of something." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "No, Richard. You gave him a home, a family. You gave him love. That's more than most people ever get." Later, as the party wound down, father and son found themselves alone on the veranda, sipping lemonade. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson. "Dad," Elijah began, his voice quiet, "about everything I've been thinking." Richard braced himself, his heart pounding a familiar rhythm of anxiety. Elijah continued, "I'm grateful for you, for Mom, for everything, but sometimes I wonder about her." He looked out at the fading light, his gaze distant. "My biological mother. I wonder what she's like." Richard's throat tightened. This was the conversation he dreaded, yet simultaneously yearned for. "We can look into it, son," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "If you want to." Elijah nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves. Then, Elijah turned to his father, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding that transcended words. "I know you love me, Dad," he said softly, "and that's all that matters." The weight of unspoken years lifted, replaced by a quiet peace. The bond between them, forged in the crucible of an extraordinary revelation, was stronger than ever before. It was a love built not on blood, but on acceptance, forgiveness, and a shared journey toward a future brimming with hope. The following Christmas, the sprawling Christmas tree in their living room, a magnificent fir reaching towards the high ceiling, seemed to mirror the family's burgeoning happiness. Ornaments, hand-painted by Elijah, sparkled under the warm glow of fairy lights. The scent of pine mingled with the rich aroma of roasting turkey, filling the air with festive cheer. Eleanor watched Richard, his face illuminated by the tree's soft glow, carefully placing a star atop the tree. The harsh lines around his eyes seemed to have softened, replaced by a gentle warmth. "It's beautiful, Richard," Eleanor murmured, her voice thick with emotion. She touched his arm, a silent gesture of affection, a testament to their shared journey. Richard turned, his smile hesitant but genuine. "It is, isn't it? Just like everything else." He paused, his gaze drifting towards Elijah, who was engrossed in a lively conversation with Eleanor's sister. A quiet contentment settled over his features. The guilt that had once consumed him was now a faint whisper, overshadowed by the overwhelming joy of his family. Later, during the quieter moments after the festivities, Richard found Elijah alone in the library, surrounded by books. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls lined with shelves overflowing with literature. Elijah looked up, startled but not unhappy to see his father. "Hi, Dad," Elijah said, a faint smile playing on his lips. He gestured towards a thick volume on African history. "I've been researching my heritage." Richard sat beside him, feeling a familiar surge of emotion, a mixture of pride and a lingering sense of regret. "I'm proud of you, son," he said quietly, his voice husky with emotion. "You're brave, you're intelligent, and you're my son." Elijah looked at him, his eyes filled with a depth of understanding beyond his years. "I know, Dad, and I love you too." He paused, then added softly, "I still sometimes think about my biological mother. I wonder, but it doesn't matter as much anymore." He closed the book, the simple act carrying the weight of acceptance and closure. Richard reached out, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder, the touch conveying a silent promise, a bond forged in the fires of adversity and cemented in the warmth of love. The fire crackled, the rhythmic sound a comforting soundtrack to their unspoken conversation. The future remained uncertain, yet here, in this quiet moment, surrounded by the vestiges of Christmas cheer, the foundation of their unconventional family felt strong, unbreakable, and filled with love. The air was thick with unspoken understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared journey, and the promise of a brighter future. Years passed. Elijah thrived, excelling in school, his quiet intelligence blossoming into a confident charisma. The sprawling estate, once a symbol of Richard's cold ambition, now echoed with laughter and the comforting sounds of family life. Sundays were reserved for long walks in the sprawling gardens, the scent of blooming roses mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil. Richard, his face softened by time and experience, would often find himself watching Elijah, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He'd learned to express his love, not through grand gestures, but through small, meaningful acts, a shared joke over breakfast, a hand on Elijah's shoulder during a quiet moment. One crisp autumn afternoon, while raking leaves in the expansive yard, Elijah paused, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. "Dad," he began, his voice barely a whisper above the rustling leaves. "I've been thinking about finding her." Richard's heart skipped a beat. The mention of Elijah's biological mother, a subject they'd carefully navigated for years, still held a tinge of unspoken anxiety. He knelt beside his son, the cool earth grounding him. "Finding who, son?" he asked gently, his voice a careful balance of concern and support. Elijah looked up, his gaze steady. "My biological mother. I wanted to know her." The weight of unspoken questions hung in the crisp air, heavy with the scent of fallen leaves. Richard saw a flicker of uncertainty in his son's eyes, a hint of fear mingled with a powerful yearning. Richard felt a pang of guilt, a familiar ache in his chest. He'd spent years running from his past, but his son was bravely stepping towards his. "Of course, son," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We can do that together. We'll find out what we can." The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, painting the scene with a poignant warmth, a silent testament to the profound bond between father and son, forged in the crucible of a shared journey, one born not of blood, but of love. The future stretched before them, uncertain yet filled with a quiet promise of understanding, acceptance, and a love that transcended the boundaries of blood. A shared joke over breakfast, a thoughtful friend. He knelt beside his son, the cool earth, finding who, son, voice a careful balance of his gaze steady. "I wanted to know her." The weight of in the crisp air. Richard saw a flicker of fear mingled with a power. Richard felt a pang of guilt, a familiar ache. He'd spent years running, stepping towards his voice thick with emotion. "That together, we'll find out what we can." A silent testament between father and son, forged in the one born not of blood, but of love, stretched before them, quiet promise of understanding that transcended the boundary. cool earth. The weight of in the crisp air. Fear mingled with a power. Felt a pang of guilt. A familiar ache. He'd spent years running, stepping towards his voice thick with emotion. Together, we'll find out what we can. A silent test forged in the not of blood, but of love stretched before them. In the crisp air. Fear mingled with a power. Felt a pang of guilt. A familiar ache. He'd spent years running, stepping towards his together, we'll find out what we can. Forged in the not of blood, but of love. Together, we'll find out what we can.